Hello, welcome to Nytheric Horror. Tonight, enjoy 3 hours of true scary stories, mysterious encounters, and disturbing experiences. Ads may play during the first 15 minutes, and after 2 hours, 30 minutes. No mid-roll ads in between. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, close your eyes, and let the nightmare begin. When I was 10 years old, I had a friend over for a sleepover in my room, the kind of ordinary weekend arrangement that happens in countless households every single week. 2 kids staying up too late, talking about nothing in particular, enjoying that specific kind of freedom that only comes with a night away from the usual rules of bedtime. My room back then was a loft space, situated up and separate from the rest of the house, in a way that made it feel like its own private little world, accessible by a set of stairs that led down into the main living area below. I loved that room for exactly that reason, the sense of separation it gave me. A space that felt entirely my own even while still technically being part of the larger house. Close enough to my parents that I never felt truly alone, but far enough removed that it always felt like a small kingdom I had complete control over. That particular sense of separation, the distance between my room and the rest of the family, would end up meaning something very different to me by the time that night was over. My friend, who I had known since early elementary school, had stayed over at my house plenty of times before that particular night, enough that our sleepovers had settled into a fairly predictable routine by that point. Snacks smuggled up from the kitchen, whatever cartoons or movies we could talk my parents into letting us watch a little past our usual bedtime, and eventually retreating up to my loft bedroom once the rest of the house had gone quiet for the evening. That night started out no differently from any of the others. Nothing about the early part of the evening giving either of us any reason to expect that anything unusual was about to happen. My friend and I had, in what felt at the time like a stroke of genius engineering, set up 2 separate radios at opposite ends of my room, one near the door and one near the far wall by my bed, an arrangement we had proudly decided counted as our own homemade version of surround sound. Neither of us had any real understanding of how actual surround sound worked. Of course, we were only 10 years old, but the idea of having music playing from 2 different directions at once felt impressively sophisticated to us at the time. The kind of setup that made our little sleepover feel like a genuinely special occasion rather than just another ordinary night. Both radios belonged to me, small handheld units I had gotten as gifts over the previous couple of birthdays, and I remember feeling a real sense of pride showing my friend how the 2 of them, positioned carefully on opposite sides of the room, created this small, makeshift sense of surrounding sound that neither of us had ever bothered to try before. We had both radios tuned to the same station, playing some music we liked at a moderate volume, filling the room with sound as we went about the usual business of a sleepover evening. Snacks and conversation and whatever games we had brought upstairs with us to pass the time. At some point during the evening, we decided it was time to head downstairs to brush our teeth before finally settling in for the night, following the same routine either of us would have followed at any other sleepover we had ever had. We left the radios playing behind us, not thinking twice about it, the same way you would leave any radio playing in an empty room you intended to return to in a few minutes. The walk down to the bathroom and back was nothing eventful, just the ordinary shuffle of 2 tired kids going through the motions of getting ready for bed, brushing our teeth, maybe splashing some water on our faces, exchanging a little bit of the kind of silly conversation that fills those in between moments during a sleepover when nothing important is really happening. Just 2 friends enjoying each other's company. When we came back upstairs and walked back into my room, the first thing we both noticed, almost immediately, was that something about the sound in the room had changed. Instead of the music we had left playing on both radios only a few minutes earlier, Both of them were now producing nothing but static, that harsh, hissing white noise you get when a radio loses its signal or drifts off the station it was previously tuned to. I remember pausing right there in the doorway, my toothbrush still in hand, listening to that flat, uniform hiss filling a room that had been full of music just minutes before, and feeling a small, unfamiliar prickle of unease creep up the back of my neck even before I had consciously decided anything was actually wrong. I remember the two of us exchanging a confused look, both of us equally puzzled by this, since neither radio had any reason to have shifted off its station on its own in the short time we had been downstairs. Radios, at least the simple ones we were using, do not typically just retune themselves without someone physically adjusting the dial. And neither of us had touched either radio before heading down to brush our teeth. Still, at 10 years old, our first instinct was not fear, but simple, mild annoyance. The kind of minor frustration you feel when something you set up carefully has gone slightly wrong for no obvious reason. I remember thinking that maybe the signal had just dropped out briefly, the way radio signals sometimes do, depending on weather or interference, and that it would probably sort itself back out if I just walked over and adjusted the dial slightly to bring the station back into focus. My friend, standing near his own radio at the far end of the room, seemed to be having the same thought, reaching almost simultaneously toward the dial on his side. Both of us moving through the same simple, practical impulse to just fix the small technical hiccup and get back to our evening without giving it any further thought. Without thinking much more about it than that, I walked toward the radio closest to my bedroom door, intending to fix whatever small glitch had knocked it off its station, my hand already reaching out toward the dial to make the small adjustment I assumed would solve the problem. Before my fingers ever actually made contact with that dial, the static coming from the radio was suddenly and violently interrupted. A voice, deep and unmistakably male, cut through that steady hiss of white noise with a harsh, guttural growl. 4 words spoken with a clarity and a menace that neither my friend nor I have ever forgotten in all the years since. "Don't you dare touch that dial." The words landed with a weight that felt entirely disproportionate to their length, each one delivered slowly and deliberately, as though whoever had spoken them wanted to make absolutely certain there was no possible way I could mistake or misunderstand the warning being given to me. I froze completely, my hands still hovering in midair only inches from where I had been reaching. Every muscle in my body suddenly locked in place by a fear so immediate and so total that I could not have moved even if I had wanted to in that first frozen instant. The voice had not sounded like a radio host, had not carried any of the smooth, practiced quality you would expect from an actual broadcast, whether music, talk radio, or anything else that might normally come through those speakers. It had sounded close, immediate, and deliberately, personally directed at me, as though whoever or whatever had spoken those words had been watching my exact movement toward that dial and had responded specifically and precisely to what I was about to do. The instant after that voice finished speaking, the radio returned immediately to nothing but plain static. The same hissing white noise as before, as though nothing at all had just happened, as though those 4 words had never actually been spoken at all. I stood there frozen for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only a few seconds, staring at that radio, my mind racing to try to process what I had just heard, searching desperately for some rational explanation that might make sense of it, some strange interference picking up a stray radio broadcast from somewhere else, some kind of prank my friend had somehow set up without my noticing, some malfunction in the radio itself that had somehow produced a burst of sound resembling human speech purely by accident. Nothing I could come up with in that panicked moment felt anywhere close to adequate. each possible explanation collapsing under its own weight the more I tried to make it fit what had actually just happened. I turned to look at my friend, half hoping to see some expression on his face that would tell me he had somehow orchestrated this, that this had all been an elaborate joke meant to scare me during our sleepover, the kind of prank 10-year-old boys sometimes attempt on each other for a cheap laugh. Instead, his face was just as pale and just as frozen as I imagined mine must have been in that moment, his eyes wide, his whole body rigid with the exact same fear I was feeling myself. He had heard it too, exactly the way I had heard it. The same voice, the same words, the same abrupt return to static immediately afterward. Whatever had just happened, it was not something either of us had staged or imagined individually. We had both experienced it together, at the exact same moment, in a way that left absolutely no room for either of us to dismiss it as some trick of our own overactive imagination. I remember him whispering my name, barely audible, his voice shaking in a way I had never heard from him before in all the years we had known each other, and I remember not being able to answer him at first, my own throat too tight with fear to produce any sound at all. Neither of us said anything for what felt like a long stretch of silence, both of us simply standing there in the middle of my loft bedroom, staring at that radio as though it might do something else at any moment, as though that voice might return with some further instruction or warning we would somehow need to obey. The static continued playing steadily from both radios, unbroken and uneventful, for the remainder of that night, never once shifting or interrupting itself again the way it had that single, terrifying time. Whatever had spoken through that radio seemed to have said exactly what it wanted to say, delivered its single sharp warning, and then retreated back into whatever silence or static it had originally emerged from, leaving the two of us standing there in the aftermath, thoroughly and completely shaken. I do not remember exactly how long we stood there before either of us finally found the nerve to move again, though I remember it feeling like an unusually long time for two 10-year-old boys who would normally have already been chattering away about what had just happened, filling the silence the way children instinctively do when something strange occurs. This time, neither of us said a word, both of us apparently too afraid even to discuss what we had just witnessed, as though speaking about it out loud might somehow draw that voice back out of the radio a second time, an unspoken agreement passing between us, without either of us needing to say it directly. Eventually, I think it was my friend who finally broke the silence, suggesting in a small, unsteady voice that maybe we should go sleep downstairs instead, an idea I agreed with immediately and without a shred of hesitation, already halfway to the stairs myself before he had even finished the sentence. We gathered up our pillows and blankets as quickly as we possibly could, moving with the kind of efficient, wordless urgency that only genuine fear can produce in two young boys, neither of us wanting to spend one more second in that room than we absolutely had to. I remember deliberately avoiding looking directly at either radio as we packed up our things, some instinctive part of me convinced that maintaining eye contact with them might somehow provoke whatever had spoken through them only minutes before. An irrational thought, perhaps, but one that felt entirely reasonable to my 10-year-old mind in that particular moment. My friend kept glancing back toward the door of my room as we gathered our things, as though he expected something to come through it at any second. And I found myself doing the same thing without ever consciously deciding to. Both of us moving through that packing process with our nerves stretched tight, ready to bolt the moment either of us saw or heard anything else out of the ordinary. We left both radios exactly where they were, still quietly hissing out their steady stream of static, and made our way down the stairs from my loft bedroom into the main part of the house, neither of us saying much of anything until we were safely settled in the living room below, with the television on for some background noise and company. Getting down those stairs felt, at the time, like one of the longer walks of my entire young life, even though in reality, it could only have taken a few seconds. I remember gripping the railing tightly with one hand while clutching my pillow against my chest with the other, my eyes fixed straight ahead on the bottom of the staircase, resisting every urge to glance back over my shoulder toward my bedroom door, worried about what I might see if I did. My friend stayed close behind me the entire way down, close enough that I could hear his breathing, quick and shallow, matching the same anxious rhythm I could feel in my own chest. Neither of us relaxed even slightly until we had both feet firmly on the ground floor of the house, surrounded by the familiar, reassuring shapes of the living room furniture, safely removed from whatever had happened up in that loft only minutes before. I do remember, once we were finally downstairs and had built ourselves a makeshift bed out of blankets and couch cushions on the living room floor, that we finally started talking about what had happened, comparing our memories of it almost obsessively, both of us needing that mutual confirmation that we had genuinely experienced the same impossible thing together rather than each of us somehow imagining it independently. We went over every detail multiple times that night, the exact words the voice had used, the specific tone of it, deep and rough and utterly unlike anything either of us had ever heard come out of a radio before, whether from music, talk shows, or anything else. Neither of our accounts of what happened ever differed from each other in any meaningful way, no matter how many times we ran through it, which only made the whole thing feel even more solidly, undeniably real, rather than something either of us could eventually convince ourselves we had misheard or misunderstood. We tried at various points during that long conversation to come up with some kind of logical explanation that might make the whole thing feel less impossible, the way children often do when confronted with something too strange to simply accept, without at least attempting to reason it away first. My friend suggested maybe it had been some kind of prank broadcast, a local radio station playing some sort of Halloween-themed content, even though it was nowhere near that time of year. Though neither of us could actually recall which station we had originally tuned the radios to, and neither station we could think of seemed like the kind that would air something so oddly specific and threatening in the middle of an ordinary evening. I suggested, somewhat desperately, that maybe it had been some kind of interference from a nearby walkie-talkie or CB radio, some neighbor or passing vehicle accidentally broadcasting on a frequency close enough to overlap with our station, though even as I said it out loud, I did not fully believe it myself, the words falling flat between us in that quiet living room. Every explanation we tried on together eventually fell apart under the weight of how specific and how immediate that voice had sounded, how precisely it had responded to my exact movement toward the dial, rather than simply appearing as some random, disconnected snippet of unrelated broadcast. Eventually, worn out from both the fear and the late hour, we did manage to fall asleep down there on the living room floor, though I remember waking up several times throughout that night, my eyes snapping open at every small sound the house made, checking instinctively to make sure my friend was still there beside me, and that nothing unusual had crept down those stairs after us while we slept. Morning eventually came, the way it always does, sunlight filling the living room windows and making the whole experience feel just slightly more distant, slightly easier to set aside for the moment, even though neither of us had forgotten a single detail of what had actually happened only hours before. We did not tell my parents what had happened that night, not right away. Both of us somehow instinctively deciding, without ever actually discussing it directly, that this was not the kind of thing adults would take seriously. Or worse, that they might simply assume we had made the whole thing up to explain some minor mischief. Perhaps a broken radio or some other mundane household issue we were trying to avoid taking responsibility for. My parents did wake up briefly at one point during the night, noticing the two of us camped out in the living room instead of upstairs where they had left us. But when they asked sleepily what had happened, we simply told them we had decided to sleep downstairs for fun, that we wanted to watch a movie and had gotten too tired to make it back up to my room afterward. They accepted that explanation without much question, too tired themselves at that hour to press us further, and went back to bed without ever suspecting that anything more serious had actually driven us out of my room in the first place. It was only the next morning, once daylight had made the whole experience feel slightly more distant and slightly less overwhelming, that I finally worked up the nerve to mention it briefly to my mother, watching her reaction carefully as I described what had happened. She listened, mostly indulgent, suggesting that we had probably just caught some strange, stray broadcast, maybe an interference from a nearby radio tower or a passing car with a powerful sound system. Some rational explanation that would account for a single strange voice cutting briefly through static before returning to normal. I remember not fully believing that explanation even as she offered it, though I also remember being grateful for it in a way, glad to have something, anything, to hold on to that made the whole event feel slightly less impossible than it had actually felt in the moment. My friend and I went back up to my loft bedroom the following day, in the safety of full daylight, both of us feeling considerably braver, with the sun streaming in through the windows and the ordinary sounds of the rest of the house going on around us. Both radios were sitting exactly where we had left them, both still producing nothing but that same steady stream of static, entirely unremarkable in the light of day, looking for all the world like two perfectly ordinary radios that had simply lost their signal overnight for some perfectly ordinary reason. We stood in the doorway for a moment before either of us actually stepped inside, neither of us quite ready to fully commit to being back in that room, both of us scanning the space carefully as though searching for some visible sign of whatever had spoken to us the night before, some evidence we could point to that would finally explain everything. Though, of course, there was nothing at all out of place, everything sitting exactly where we had left it in our hurry to escape. I remember reaching out, tentatively, to adjust the dial on the one nearest the door, the same one I had been reaching for the night before when that voice had stopped me cold, half expecting something to happen again. Some echo of that same warning, some flicker of static interrupted by that same deep, growling voice. Nothing happened at all. The dial turned smoothly under my fingers, the static faded away, and the station we had originally been listening to came back through clearly, playing ordinary music exactly the way it should have all along. That radio never did anything unusual again after that single night. Not that I ever witnessed. Not in all the months and years I continued using it afterward in that same loft bedroom. Whatever had spoken through it that one particular evening never returned, never repeated itself. Never gave either of us any further indication that anything unusual had ever actually happened at all, beyond that single sharp warning and the silence that followed it. I kept both radios for years after that, well into my teenage years, occasionally lending one or the other to friends or using them myself for ordinary purposes, listening to music while doing homework, catching the occasional ball game, all without a single further incident of any kind. And yet, despite the radio's continued ordinary behavior in the months and years that came after, I never again felt entirely comfortable adjusting either dial without a small flicker of hesitation first, some old instinctive part of me still half expecting, every single time, to hear that same deep voice cut through the static and tell me, once again, not to dare touch that dial. My friend and I have talked about that night many times over the years since, even now as adults, usually with a kind of nervous laughter that never quite manages to fully dispel the genuine unease still sitting underneath it whenever the memory comes up. We drifted apart somewhat after high school, the way old friends often do once life pulls people in different directions, different colleges, different cities, different circles of new friends replacing the old ones over time. But whenever we do manage to reconnect, whether at a reunion or through some chance run-in, that particular memory almost always comes up eventually. Usually somewhere late in the conversation once enough time has passed for both of us to feel comfortable bringing it back into the light. We have never managed to come up with any explanation that actually satisfies both of us. No rational theory about stray broadcasts or electrical interference that adequately accounts for four such specific, threatening words spoken in direct response to my exact movement toward that dial, words that stopped the instant my hand paused, and that never repeated themselves again in all the years since. All I know for certain, all these years later, is that whatever spoke through that radio that night meant exactly what it said. And that some small part of me, even now, still believes it would be wise not to test that particular warning a second time. When my twin brother and I were still kids, summer vacation meant one thing above everything else: sleeping in as late as our bodies would allow, staying up far too late the night before playing games or watching television long past when we should have gone to bed. And then drifting into that lazy, unstructured rhythm that only exists during those few precious months when there is no school schedule dictating your life. Our house back then was an older two-story place at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The kind of house that made small settling sounds throughout the night that we had long since learned to tune out. Creaks in the floorboards and soft groans in the walls that never meant anything more than an old structure adjusting to the changing temperature outside. It was during one of those long, formless summer nights that something happened in our house that neither of us has ever been able to fully explain. Something that still occasionally surfaces in our conversations even now, decades later, always accompanied by the same uneasy silence that follows whenever we try to talk about it in any real detail. Our father had gone out that evening. Nothing unusual about that in itself, since he often ran errands or met up with friends in the evenings during the summer when the heat of the day had finally broken and the air outside felt more bearable. Our mother had already gone up to bed a little earlier than usual that night, tired from a long day, leaving my brother and me downstairs on our own the way she often did once we were old enough to be trusted for an hour or two without direct supervision. We had the television on low, half watching some late-night rerun neither of us particularly cared about, mostly just enjoying the lazy, unstructured freedom of being awake this late with nowhere we needed to be in the morning. What made that particular night different from the dozens of similar evenings that came before it was that our father never actually made it back home, at least not in the way we expected. He had a very specific way of knocking on our front door whenever he forgot his keys, a distinct rhythm he always used. 3 short knocks followed by a slightly longer pause and then 2 more. A pattern so familiar to my brother and me that we could have picked it out instantly from any other knock in the world. It was practically a kind of code between our family, something so specific and so consistent that neither of us ever had to think twice about it whenever we heard it. The moment either of us caught that particular rhythm against the front door, we knew immediately, without any doubt at all, that it was our dad standing outside, waiting to be let in. We had heard that same knock hundreds of times over the years, and it had never once, not a single time before that night, been anything other than exactly what it sounded like. That night, sometime around 11 o'clock, Long after our mother had already gone to bed and left the two of us alone downstairs, watching television in the dim glow of the living room, we heard that exact knock. 3 short raps, a pause, then 2 more. The pattern so precise and so familiar that neither of us hesitated for even a second. We jumped up from the couch immediately, practically racing each other to the front door, already talking to each other about how Dad had probably forgotten his keys again, the way he sometimes did, laughing a little at the predictability of it as we hurried down the front hallway, our socked feet sliding slightly on the wood floor in our haste to reach the door before the other one could claim. The small victory of getting there first. Even in our rush, some small habit of caution kicked in. The kind of thing you were taught to do as a kid, even when you are fairly certain who is on the other side of the door. Before opening it, we called out, asking who was knocking, expecting to hear our father's familiar voice answer back immediately. Maybe with some tired joke about forgetting his keys again, or teasing us for taking too long to answer. Instead, there was nothing. No response at all. Just silence on the other side of that door. A silence that felt oddly heavy, given how certain we had both been only seconds earlier that we knew exactly who was standing there. My brother and I looked at each other, both of us a little confused, but not yet particularly worried, and after a moment we simply shrugged it off, telling each other that we had probably just imagined the sound. Or that maybe Dad had already given up waiting and gone around to try a different door. Or that we had simply misheard something entirely unrelated to a knock at all. Summer nights carry all kinds of odd sounds, we told ourselves. Insects and settling houses and distant traffic. And it was easy enough in that moment to convince ourselves that our ears had simply played a small trick on us. We even debated briefly whether to just open the door anyway, reasoning that if it really was Dad playing some kind of joke, he would eventually get tired of standing out there in the dark, waiting for a reaction that was not coming. We had barely turned back around to head toward the living room when we heard it again. The exact same knock. 3 short raps, that same distinct pause, then 2 more, played out against the front door with the same precise rhythm as before. Impossible to mistake for anything else. This time there was no room left for shrugging it off as imagination. Not when we had both heard it identically, twice in a row, within the space of only a minute or two. We turned back toward the door again, and once more called out asking who was there, our voices a little less steady than before. A small thread of uncertainty creeping into what had started as simple curiosity. And once again, there was no answer. Nothing but silence pressing back against us from the other side of that door. A silence that somehow felt different this time. Heavier, more deliberate, as though whatever was standing out there was choosing not to answer rather than simply being unable to. I remember pressing my ear closer to the door for a brief moment, straining to catch any hint of movement or breathing on the other side, and hearing absolutely nothing at all. Not even the ordinary sounds of someone shifting their weight while they waited. That was the point, where the two of us started to feel genuinely uneasy rather than merely puzzled. We were still young enough and stubborn enough to try to explain the whole thing away as some kind of joke our father was playing on us, the sort of thing he occasionally did when he was in a particularly playful mood, knocking and staying quiet just to make us wonder, before eventually bursting out laughing at our confused expressions once we finally opened the door. Clinging to that explanation, or at least trying to, we decided the safest thing to do was head upstairs, putting some distance between ourselves and the front door while we waited to see what would happen next, half expecting to hear our father's laughter break the silence and reveal the whole thing as nothing more than an elaborate joke at our expense. Looking back now, I am not entirely sure why heading upstairs felt safer than simply staying near the door, except that some instinct in both of us, young as we were, seemed to understand that putting a floor between ourselves and whatever was outside felt better than standing directly in front of it, waiting to see what happened next. We had barely made it partway up the stairs when we heard something else entirely. A sound that neither of us has ever been able to describe with total confidence, though we have both tried many times over the years, whenever the memory comes up. It sounded exactly like a doorknob turning, followed immediately by the unmistakable creak and swing of a door opening. The specific sound our bedroom door always made whenever it moved on its slightly stiff old hinges. The problem, the detail that turned our uneasy curiosity into outright fear in an instant, was that our bedroom door was closed. We both knew it was closed. We had closed it ourselves earlier that evening before coming downstairs to watch television, the way we always did. And there was no reason at all for it to suddenly be opening on its own from somewhere upstairs, while the two of us stood frozen together on the staircase, listening to a sound that should not have been possible, given exactly where we were and exactly what we already knew to be true about the state of that door. Being twins, my brother and I had always shared a kind of shorthand between us that other siblings sometimes envied, an ability to communicate entire thoughts with nothing more than a glance, a quality that made the fear in that moment feel somehow more intense than it might have for two children who were not so closely bonded. I did not need him to say anything out loud for me to know exactly what he was thinking. And he did not need me to explain what I had just heard for him to understand it just as clearly as I did. Whatever confidence we had managed to hold on to up to that point evaporated completely the instant that door sound reached us from somewhere upstairs, replaced by a shared, wordless certainty that something in our house that night was very wrong. Neither of us said anything to each other in that moment. We did not need to. I remember catching my brother's eye and seeing my own fear mirrored back at me exactly. The same wide, uncertain look that comes when a child's mind is trying desperately to find some rational explanation and coming up completely empty. Without any real discussion between us, we both turned at almost the exact same instant and ran, taking the remaining stairs two at a time, our bare feet slapping hard against the wood, driven by an instinct that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with pure animal fear. It was as we were running that we heard the footsteps behind us. Heavy ones, distinctly heavier and more forceful than either of our own light. Quick steps, thudding against the stairs with a rhythm that made it unmistakably clear that something else was climbing those same stairs right along with us, moving fast, closing the distance behind us with every second that passed. We did not dare look back, both of us too terrified to slow down, even for the fraction of a second it would have taken to glance over our shoulders and confirm what we were hearing. When we finally did risk a glance back once we reached the top landing, there was nothing there. No one behind us at all, despite the fact that we could both still hear, or at least believed we could still hear, those same heavy footsteps somewhere close behind, as though whatever was chasing us existed just slightly outside whatever range our eyes were capable of registering in that frantic, adrenaline-soaked moment. That brief, useless glance back cost us precious seconds, and the moment we turned forward again, the footsteps seemed even closer than before, as though our hesitation had somehow allowed whatever was behind us to gain ground. We sprinted the rest of the way down the hallway toward our shared bedroom, reaching the door together, both of us grabbing for it at the same time, desperate to get inside and slam it shut behind us, needing that thin barrier of wood between ourselves and whatever was following so close behind. The hallway had never felt so long before. every familiar picture frame and doorway along the walls blurring past us in the dim light as we ran, our own ragged breathing loud in our ears, drowning out almost everything except the pounding of those heavier footsteps somewhere behind us and the frantic thudding of our own hearts. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run faster, to not let whatever was behind us close that remaining gap, and I remember distinctly the strange, useless thought crossing my mind even in the middle of that terror, wondering how something could sound so heavy and so close without ever once appearing, when either of us dared to glance back. We threw our combined weight against the door to force it closed as quickly as possible, and instead of the door simply swinging shut the way it should have, we felt and heard a heavy, solid thud, the unmistakable impact of hitting something. Some kind of resistance meeting the door from the other side, exactly where a person's body would have been standing had someone actually been running up, right behind us. The door itself flew back open slightly from the force of that impact, bouncing away from the frame the way it would if it had genuinely collided with something solid and substantial, rather than simply swinging freely through empty air the way it should have, if nothing at all had actually been there. That thud, more than the knocking, more than the footsteps, more than the sound of our own bedroom door somehow opening on its own from downstairs, was the single moment that broke whatever remaining composure either of us had managed to hold on to up to that point. We did not try to close the door again after that. We did not stop to look behind us or investigate what exactly we had felt collide with it. We simply dove together onto the nearest bed, pulling the blankets up over our heads the way children do when some deep instinctive part of the brain believes that fabric alone can somehow stop the impossible from reaching you. And we started screaming, both of us at the top of our lungs, our voices tangled together in pure, unfiltered terror, calling out for our parents with everything we had left in us. It did not take long before we heard our mother's footsteps rushing down the hallway toward our room, followed almost immediately by our father's heavier ones right behind her. The door, the same door that only moments earlier had flown back from what felt like a direct collision with something solid, swung open easily under our mother's hand, revealing nothing more dramatic than the two of them standing there in the doorway, both looking understandably alarmed at the sound of their two children screaming bloody murder in the middle of the night. Our mother crossed the room quickly and pulled back the blankets we had buried ourselves under, her face shifting from concern to visible confusion as she took in the two of us, tangled together, both crying too hard to form a coherent sentence, our small chests still heaving from the run up the stairs, our hands still gripping fistfuls of the blanket, as though letting go of it might somehow let whatever we had been running from back in. It took several long minutes before either my brother or I could manage to explain, through tears and half-formed sentences tumbling over each other, everything that had just happened. The knocking, the silence when we called out, the sound of our door opening downstairs when we knew for certain it had been closed, the footsteps chasing us up the stairs, and finally, that heavy, undeniable thud against our bedroom door. Our father checked the hallway and the stairs while we spoke, flipping on every light switch he passed, and came back a few minutes later reporting that he had not found anything unusual. No open windows, no sign that anyone had broken in anywhere in the house. Nothing at all out of place, though he admitted, almost as an afterthought, that the air near the top of the stairs had felt strangely cold to him, colder than the rest of the house, though he brushed it off at the time as nothing more than a draft from an old window somewhere nearby. Our parents listened to the whole disjointed account patiently, exchanging a look between themselves that, looking back now as an adult, I recognize as the particular kind of look parents share when they do not want to alarm their children further, but are genuinely troubled by what they are hearing. Our mother assured us gently that it had probably all been our imaginations running away with us, the kind of thing that happens easily to two overtired kids up far too late during summer vacation. Minds primed for fear after a long day and an even longer evening of television. It was a comforting explanation, and in that moment, wrapped safely between both of our parents, exhausted and thoroughly spent from all the screaming and running, we were more than willing to accept it, at least enough to finally let ourselves calm down and eventually drift off to sleep with the lights left on and our bedroom door propped wide open for the rest of that night. It was only the next morning, once the fear of the previous night had faded into the safer, more manageable territory of daylight memory, that the explanation our mother had offered the night before completely fell apart. Our father, still slightly bleary-eyed over his morning coffee, mentioned in passing that he had never actually left the house at all that entire night, that he had been upstairs the whole time, working quietly in a back room, focused enough on what he was doing that he had not even realized how late it had gotten until he finally came out to check on everyone and found the house eerily quiet, every light left burning and our bedroom door standing wide open. He had assumed, when he first noticed the lights, that we had simply forgotten to turn them off before bed, another ordinary bit of childhood carelessness, and had thought nothing more of it until our mother filled him in the next morning on everything that had actually happened during the night. My brother and I sat there at the breakfast table listening to this, and I remember the exact feeling that settled over both of us at the exact same moment. A cold, sinking recognition that whatever explanation we had comforted ourselves with the night before no longer made any sense at all, not if our father had never left the house. If he had been upstairs the entire time, working quietly in that back room, then the knock we had heard, that same distinct 3 and 2 rhythm we had both recognized instantly and, without a shred of doubt, had not belonged to him. Someone, or something, had knocked on our front door using our father's exact specific pattern. A pattern that, as far as either of us knew, only our own family had ever used or would have any reason to know. Our mother, sitting across the table, went noticeably quiet at that point, no longer offering the same reassuring explanations she had given the night before, and I remember thinking, even at that young age, that her silence somehow felt more unsettling than anything she could have actually said out loud. We have talked about that night many times over the years since, my brother and I, usually not by choice so much as the memory simply resurfacing on its own during some quiet conversation, the way certain memories do no matter how much time has passed. We have never managed to come up with any explanation that actually accounts for everything we both experienced that night. It was not simply one strange sound that could be dismissed as an overactive imagination or a trick of an old house settling. It was an entire sequence of events, each one building on the last, each one confirmed independently by both of us at the exact same moment, culminating in a physical impact against our bedroom door, solid enough to send it flying back on its hinges, an impact that neither of us has ever been able to attribute to anything we can name. Over the years, we have compared notes on that night more times than I can count. Usually late at night ourselves, usually when the conversation has already wandered somewhere quiet and reflective, and one of us brings it up almost without meaning to. Every single time, our memories line up in exactly the same order, the same details, the same specific rhythm of the knock, the same silence when we called out, the same sound of a door opening that should have been closed, the same heavy footsteps behind us on the stairs, and that same final thud against our bedroom door. Neither of us has ever once remembered it differently from the other, never once softened a detail, or added something new that the other did not already recall independently. And for two people recounting a single frightening night from early childhood, that kind of consistency across so many years has always struck both of us as significant in its own quiet way. Twins are sometimes accused of finishing each other's sentences or reinforcing each other's memories simply out of closeness. But this was never that. This was two separate accounts, given independently on more than one occasion over the years, that simply happened to match perfectly every single time. We have also, more than once, tried to ask our father directly whether he remembered anything unusual about that particular summer, whether there had been any strange visitors to the neighborhood around that time, any odd occurrences he might have chosen not to mention to two frightened children the next morning. He has always maintained that he genuinely has no memory of anything out of the ordinary beyond what he already told us, that he was simply upstairs working, oblivious to everything happening 2 floors below him until he finally came out and found the house unnervingly quiet. Whether that quiet had settled in only after whatever chased us up those stairs had already given up and gone wherever it came from, none of us has ever been able to say for certain. Our mother, for her part, has always been more reluctant to discuss it at all, usually finding some reason to change the subject whenever it comes up, though on the rare occasions she has engaged with it directly. She has admitted that something about the whole account never sat right with her either, even all these years later. To this day, whenever my brother and I happen to be back at our childhood home together, visiting our parents during the holidays or some other occasion, neither of us ever fully relaxes once evening starts to fall. We joke about it sometimes, the way adults joke about the things that frightened them as children, trying to keep the memory light and manageable rather than let it sit too heavily in the room. But underneath the joking, I know my brother feels exactly what I still feel every single time. A small, persistent wariness whenever a knock comes at that particular front door late in the evening. A brief flicker of hesitation before either of us moves to answer it. Some old instinctive part of both of us still half expecting, even now, to call out asking who is there, and to be met, once again, with nothing but silence on the other side. Out of everything that happened to me in the house I grew up in, and there were more strange nights in that place than I could ever fully list, this is the one memory that still freezes something inside me whenever it surfaces. It was not the loudest incident, not the most dramatic, not the one with the most obvious explanation for why it should have terrified me. In some ways, that is exactly what makes it the worst one. There was no shadow figure, no disembodied voice, no dramatic slamming door to announce that something had gone wrong. There was only a feeling, quiet and simple and impossible to explain away, and to this day it is the memory that comes back to me first, whenever anyone asks if I believe in anything beyond what we can see and touch and prove. I must have been around 10 years old when it happened, old enough to have already grown used to the strange sounds and cold spots that seemed to live permanently in that house, but still young enough that I had not yet built up the kind of hardened numbness that comes later, the kind that lets you hear a noise in the dark and simply roll over and ignore it, because you have heard so many noises, before that one more barely registers. At 10, every strange sound still had weight. Every creak in the hallway still made my stomach tighten. I had lived in that house long enough by then to know it was not like other houses, though I still lacked the vocabulary to explain exactly what was wrong with it, and my parents, when I brought things up, tended to brush my concerns aside with the practiced patience of adults who did not want to encourage a child's overactive imagination, even when some small flicker in their own eyes suggested they were not entirely convinced by their own reassurances either. We had a dog back then, an enormous dog, easily one of the largest animals I had ever seen up close, and at 10 years old. Small and thin, the way children often are, he was genuinely close to my own size when he stood beside me. His name was Ringo, and he was, without question, my favorite thing about that entire house. The one presence in those long, unsettling hallways that always felt safe rather than uncertain. Ringo slept in my room most nights, usually right there on my bed with me, even though the bed itself was only a twin, far too small for a boy and a dog of his size to comfortably share. He did not seem to care about that at all. He would sprawl himself across most of the mattress with the total unconcern only a beloved family pet can manage, leaving me curled into whatever space remained along the edge, my back pressed against the wall, my legs tucked up to make room for him. I never once complained about it. Having him there, his weight solid and warm beside me, his breathing slow and steady in the dark, made the nights in that house feel almost bearable. On the nights he was not allowed in my room for whatever reason, sickness, a bath, being kept downstairs by my parents, I remember lying awake far longer than usual, listening to every sound the house made, feeling far more exposed and alone than I liked to admit even to myself. I was, on top of everything else, a child who was deeply afraid of the dark, more afraid than most kids my age, though given everything that house put me through over the years, I think that fear was more than justified. The darkness in that house never felt empty. It felt occupied, the way a room feels occupied, even when your eyes cannot make out a shape within it, a pressure in the air, an awareness that something is present, and watching even when there is no proof of it, beyond instinct. Because of this fear, I had developed a habit, one I kept up for years without ever really examining why. Once the lights went out, I would close my eyes immediately and refuse to open them again no matter what I heard, no matter what small sounds crept through the dark toward my bed. I told myself, the way children reason about these things, that if I could not see whatever might be in the room, it somehow could not see me either. Or at the very least, I would not have to know it was there. It was not logical. It was not even particularly effective. But it was the only defense a scared 10-year-old had, and I clung to it every single night, eyes screwed shut, blanket pulled up to my chin, waiting for sleep to finally take me somewhere the dark could not follow. On the night this happened, I was lying in my bed the way I always did, eyes closed, doing my best to relax into sleep despite the low hum of unease that never fully left me in that house. I do not remember exactly how much time had passed since the lights went out, only that I was somewhere in that hazy space between full wakefulness and actual sleep. The place where your thoughts start to drift and blur, but you are not quite gone yet, still aware enough to register sounds from the world around you, even as your mind begins slipping toward dreams. It was in that hazy in-between state that I heard my bedroom door open. The sound was unmistakable, the particular creak that door always made when it swung inward. A sound I had heard so many times over the years that I could have identified it blindfolded, which of course I effectively was in that moment, eyes still shut tight against the dark. Without even thinking about it, without a flicker of fear or hesitation, I said his name out loud into the dark room. Ringo. I said it the way you say a name you trust completely, the way you greet a friend you have been waiting for, with no doubt at all about who was entering the room. It never once occurred to me in that moment that anyone or anything else might be on the other side of that door. Why would it? Ringo came and went from my room constantly, nudging the door open with his nose whenever he wanted in, and I had long since stopped needing to open my eyes to confirm his arrival. His presence was simply a fact of those nights, as reliable and expected as the darkness itself. A few seconds after I spoke his name, I felt the mattress shift beneath me, the familiar sensation of weight settling onto the bed, heavy and solid, exactly the way it always felt when Ringo climbed up to join me. The bed dipped slightly under that weight, the springs compressing just enough for me to feel the small give in the mattress beneath my legs, and I felt whatever it was settle down at the foot of the bed, right where he always slept, curling into the same spot he chose nearly every single night. I remember feeling a small wave of comfort wash over me in that moment. The tension I had not even fully realized I was holding easing out of my shoulders now that I knew he was there with me, now that the room felt occupied by something familiar and safe rather than empty and uncertain. I did not open my eyes. I did not need to. I simply reached my hand down toward the foot of the bed, the way I always did, wanting to give him a few sleepy pats before drifting fully off, wanting to feel his warm fur beneath my fingers as one last small comfort before sleep finally took me. My hand moved through empty air. I remember the confusion of that moment more clearly than almost anything else from my childhood. A strange disconnect between what I could feel and what I could not find. I could still feel the weight on the bed, still feel the mattress dip down beneath that pressure, exactly where it should be if a large dog were curled there. But when I reached my hand out to touch him, there was nothing beneath my fingers at all. Just cool sheets, flat and undisturbed, despite the clear indentation my own body could feel pressing against the mattress from somewhere at the foot of the bed. I remember frowning slightly in the dark, still more puzzled than afraid, assuming I had simply misjudged the distance, that my hand had not quite reached far enough, that Ringo had perhaps shifted position slightly while I was reaching for him. Children are remarkably good at explaining away small inconsistencies, at filling in gaps with the most comfortable possible answer rather than the most accurate one, and in that moment, still mostly asleep, still trusting completely in the safety of my own bed, I simply assumed I needed to try again. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, still keeping my eyes firmly shut out of habit, and reached further down toward the foot of the bed, patting the mattress in a wider searching motion, trying to locate the dog I could still feel weighing down the sheets, but somehow could not touch. My hand swept across cool, empty fabric, back and forth, searching for fur, for warmth, for the solid, familiar shape of my dog, and finding absolutely nothing at all. And yet, the weight remained. I could feel it distinctly, the unmistakable pressure of something heavy pressing down into the mattress at the foot of my bed, shifting slightly now and then the way a resting animal does when it settles into a more comfortable position. But no matter where my searching hands moved, they touched nothing but empty sheets. It was in that moment, kneeling there on my knees on top of my own blanket, hands patting uselessly at a bed that felt occupied but somehow was not, that the last of my drowsy comfort finally cracked completely. A cold understanding began creeping up through my chest, slow and sickening. The kind of realization that arrives in your body before your mind has fully caught up to what it means. Something was on my bed. I could feel its weight as clearly as I had ever felt anything in my life. Could see in my mind's eye the exact shape and position, where it sat. And yet my hands, moving again and again across every inch of that space, found absolutely nothing there to touch. I opened my eyes. I do not know exactly what I expected to see in that first fraction of a second after my eyes finally opened, whether some small, stubborn part of me still hoped to find Ringo there after all, curled up and perfectly visible, making a fool of my own rising panic. But there was nothing. The foot of my bed, illuminated faintly by the small amount of moonlight coming through my curtains, was completely empty. No dog, no shape, No shifting outline of anything at all, just the flat, undisturbed surface of my blanket, exactly where my hands had already searched and found nothing. And yet even as I stared directly at that empty space with my own open eyes, I could still feel it. The weight had not moved. The pressure against the mattress remained exactly where it had been the entire time. Solid and undeniable, even though there was absolutely nothing there for my eyes to confirm it. I do not remember consciously deciding to scream. I remember only that the sound came out of me before I had even fully processed what I was looking at. A raw, high, uncontrolled scream that tore up out of my chest and filled that dark bedroom before I had time to think about whether screaming was even the right response. It was not a scream born of thought or reasoning. It came from somewhere far older and more primitive than that. Some deep animal part of my brain that understood, faster than the rest of me could, that something was deeply and fundamentally wrong with the scene in front of me. That the world I trusted to make sense had just broken one of its most basic rules, right there on the foot of my own bed. I screamed the way children scream when true, unfiltered terror grips them completely, without any concern for how loud it was or who might hear it, without any thought beyond the desperate need to make the wrongness stop. I heard my mother's footsteps almost immediately, fast and heavy on the stairs, the particular urgent rhythm of a parent moving as quickly as possible toward the sound of their child in obvious distress. I do not remember much of what happened in the minutes right after that. The details blur together the way memories do when panic overtakes them, but I remember the door bursting open, the hallway light spilling in behind her silhouette, and I remember collapsing into whatever comfort she offered, sobbing too hard to properly explain what had happened, my whole body still shaking with an adrenaline I did not know what to do with. I could not tell her, not clearly, not in any way that made sense. How do you explain to your mother that you felt your dog get into bed with you, felt his weight settle onto the mattress exactly where he always slept, and then opened your eyes to find nothing there at all, nothing but empty air pressing down with a weight that had no source? I do not think I even tried to explain it fully that night. I think I simply cried until I was too exhausted to keep crying, and eventually, held tightly against my mother in a room with the lights now blazing on, I fell into an uneasy sleep that did not feel like rest at all. I do not remember exactly what happened in the rest of that night, whether I slept in my own room again or was allowed to sleep somewhere else, whether my mother stayed with me or eventually returned to her own bed once I had calmed down enough to be left alone. Those details have faded in a way the core memory never has. What I remember with absolute clarity, even now, decades later, is the feeling of that weight on my bed. So real, so undeniably physical, and the horrifying moment my searching hands found nothing there to explain it. I have never in my life been more frightened than I was in that single instant, sitting up in the dark with my eyes finally open, staring at an empty stretch of blanket that my whole body insisted was occupied by something far too heavy to be nothing at all. Looking back on it now, as an adult, I have tried many times to find some rational explanation that might account for what happened that night. The way adults always try to rationalize the things that frightened them as children, searching for some comfortable answer that lets the memory sit quietly at the back of the mind instead of clawing its way forward the way this one still does. I have wondered if I was simply dreaming, caught in that strange half-sleep state where the mind sometimes manufactures sensations so real they feel indistinguishable from waking life. I have wondered if some trick of a settling mattress, some shift in an old and uneven bed frame, might have created a sensation of weight, where none actually existed. I have turned the memory over so many times searching for a version of it that does not require anything strange or impossible to have happened. But no matter how many times I examine it, I always arrive back at the same simple, stubborn fact. I heard the door open. I called my dog by name, certain of who was arriving. I felt him settle onto the bed exactly where he always slept, his weight distinct and familiar against the mattress. And when I reached for him, when I opened my eyes and looked directly at the space where I could still feel that weight pressing down, there was nothing there at all. Ringo, for what it is worth, was found later that same night, curled up asleep on the couch downstairs, exactly where my parents had left him hours earlier before any of this happened. He had never come up the stairs. He had never opened my door. Whatever had entered my room that night, whatever had climbed onto my bed and settled itself at the foot of it with a weight heavy enough to press down the mattress and dip the springs beneath it, it was not my dog at all. It only wanted me to believe that it was, at least for those first few trusting seconds before I reached out and discovered the truth for myself. My mother told me the next morning, once daylight had made everything feel smaller and less threatening the way it always does, that Ringo had been downstairs the entire night, that the back door to the kitchen had been shut, and the baby gate at the bottom of the stairs had still been latched exactly the way it was every single night, meaning there was no possible way for him to have made his way up to my room, even if he had wanted to. She said this in the calm, reassuring voice parents use when they are trying to explain away something frightening with simple logic. The kind of voice meant to convince a child that the world still makes sense. But even at 10 years old, even desperate as I was to believe her, some part of me understood that her explanation did nothing to actually account for what I had felt. It did not explain the sound of the door opening, a sound I had heard countless times before and knew without question. It did not explain the weight settling onto my bed exactly where Ringo always slept, real enough to dip the mattress, real enough that my hands searched for solid fur and warmth without a shred of doubt that they would find it. My mother's explanation solved the problem of where the dog physically was that night. It did nothing at all to explain what had been in my room instead. For weeks afterward, I refused to sleep with my door fully closed, insisting instead that it stay open just enough to let a sliver of hallway light spill across my floor, as if that thin line of brightness could somehow serve as a barrier against whatever might try to enter again. I also refused, for a long time, to keep my eyes closed once the lights went out, breaking a habit I had relied on for years simply because closing my eyes now felt more dangerous than the darkness itself. I would lie there instead, staring up at the ceiling, forcing myself to stay awake as long as possible, listening for the creak of that door, promising myself that if I ever heard it again, I would keep my eyes open the entire time, that I would not make the same mistake twice. Looking back, I understand now how exhausting that must have been for a child my age, how many nights I must have spent running on almost no real rest, simply because the alternative, closing my eyes and trusting the dark completely, no longer felt like something I was capable of doing. I never told very many people about what happened that night, not in any real detail, not for a very long time. It was not the kind of story that fit neatly into conversation, not like some of the louder, more dramatic incidents from that house that I could at least turn into something resembling entertainment when people asked if the place had really been as strange as my family always hinted. This one felt different, too quiet and too personal to share easily, too difficult to explain in a way that captured how genuinely wrong it had felt in the moment. How do you make someone understand the particular horror of feeling something with total certainty, feeling its weight and its presence as clearly as you have ever felt anything in your life? and then opening your eyes to prove to yourself that nothing was there at all. It is one thing to see something frightening. It is another thing entirely to feel something frightening with your own hands and body, to have your senses contradict each other so completely that you can no longer trust either one, and to know that whatever explanation you eventually settle on, some part of you will never quite believe it. Even now, so many years later, living in a completely different house in a completely different part of the world, I still find myself occasionally testing the darkness the way I did as a child, reaching a hand toward the foot of my own bed before I let myself fully drift off to sleep, just to confirm, quickly and quietly, that there is nothing there. It is a small habit, barely noticeable most nights, easy to dismiss as nothing more than an old leftover quirk from a childhood spent in a house that was never quite right. But every so often, on the nights when the house is especially quiet and my mind is especially tired, I find myself hesitating just a little longer than usual before that hand moves. Some small, stubborn part of me still half expecting to feel a weight there that has no source, still half remembering exactly how real it felt the one time it actually happened. That house gave me more strange nights over the years than I can count. Moments I have mostly learned to file away and rarely think about anymore. Sounds and shadows and feelings that never quite added up to anything I could fully explain. But this is the one that still visits me sometimes, late at night, when the house I live in now goes quiet, and I find myself, even as a grown adult, oddly reluctant to reach my hand down toward the foot of my own bed in the dark. I tell myself it is only an old childhood memory, nothing more than the overactive imagination of a frightened 10-year-old boy who loved his dog and lived in a house that was never quite right. But some small, stubborn part of me, the same part that screamed bloody murder that night without waiting for permission from the rest of my mind, still remembers exactly how real that weight felt, and still refuses to fully believe that nothing was there at all. Ringo lived a long, full life after that, well into his old age, and he continued sleeping in my room most nights for years afterward, sprawled across that same small bed exactly the way he always had, and I never once felt anything like that again while he was actually there beside me, warm and solid and unmistakably real. In a strange way, his ordinary presence over the following years almost made the memory worse rather than better, because it gave me a clear, permanent measure of what he actually felt like against my legs at the foot of that bed, a comparison I could never fully shake whenever my mind wandered back to the one night his weight had been there without him. I know the exact difference now between the real thing and whatever came to visit me that one time, and it is that precise, specific difference, rather than any vague sense of unease, that keeps the memory sharp even after all these years. It was not a case of a child mistaking an ordinary shadow for something sinister, or letting an overactive imagination fill in gaps that were never really there. I knew exactly what my dog felt like on that bed, night after night, for years both before and after that single incident, and whatever settled onto my mattress that particular evening was not him, no matter how badly some small, hopeful part of me wanted it to be. What I am about to share happened almost 8 years ago, back when I was only 20 years old, and even now, all this time later, there are nights when I still find myself lying awake, wondering exactly what it was that my roommate and I lived through in that house. Some memories fade with time, softening at the edges until you can no longer be completely sure how much of what you remember is real and how much has been shaped by years of retelling. This is not one of those memories. If anything, the years have only made it feel sharper, stranger, and somehow more disturbing than it did in the moment. because back then I was too frightened and too young to fully understand just how wrong everything about that place had been. At the time, my best friend and I were both in a difficult spot, the kind of situation where you need a place to live immediately and cannot afford to be picky about where you end up. We had been searching for weeks, running into dead ends everywhere, our options narrowing with every passing day until we were both starting to feel a familiar creeping panic about where we would actually sleep once our current arrangements fell through. So when we found a basement apartment close to downtown, a 2-bedroom unit renting for an almost unbelievably low $650 a month, we jumped on it without asking too many questions. We both knew, walking through it for the first time, that it was a complete dump. The carpet was stained in places we did not want to think too hard about. The walls were thin and uneven, and there was a general damp, heavy smell in the air that never quite seemed to go away no matter how many windows we opened. But at that price, in that location, with our options as limited as they were, it felt like exactly the kind of temporary sacrifice you make when you are young and broke and just trying to get through to the next stable thing. We told ourselves it would only be for a few months, just long enough to save up and find somewhere better. Neither of us had any idea what those few months were actually going to involve. The trouble started almost immediately, within the first few days of us moving our things in and trying to settle into some kind of normal routine. I began having nightmares, bad ones, the kind that jolt you awake, gasping with your heart slamming against your ribs, leaving behind nothing but a residue of pure terror and absolutely no memory of what had actually happened in the dream itself. Night after night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, utterly convinced that something terrible had just happened, or was about to happen, my body flooded with adrenaline, for reasons I could never pin down once I was fully conscious. I would lie there in the dark afterward, heart still pounding, straining to remember even a single detail of whatever had frightened me so badly, and every single time my mind would come up completely empty, leaving me with nothing but the lingering physical sensation of terror and no explanation at all to attach it to. At first, I tried to explain it away the same way anyone would, telling myself it was simply the stress of moving, the strangeness of a new place, the natural adjustment period that comes with sleeping somewhere unfamiliar for the first time. Everyone has trouble sleeping in a new home for the first week or two, I told myself. And eventually, my body would settle into the new routine, and the nightmares would fade on their own. But they did not fade. If anything, they grew more frequent and more intense as the days went on, until I genuinely began to dread going to sleep at all, lying awake far longer than I needed to, simply because some part of me was trying to postpone whatever waited for me the moment I finally drifted off. I started keeping a small lamp on in the corner of my room, something I had not done since I was a young child, telling myself it was only to make it easier to find my way to the bathroom in the middle of the night, though even then I think I understood, somewhere underneath that excuse, that I simply did not want to be in complete darkness in that apartment anymore. After about a week of this pattern repeating itself almost every single night, something else began to develop alongside the nightmares. Something even harder to explain away as ordinary stress or an uncomfortable new environment. Whenever I was in my bedroom, even during the day, even with the lights on, I started to feel an overwhelming, specific sense of dread, a conviction that grew stronger by the day that someone was going to break through my bedroom wall and kill me. I want to be clear that this was not some vague, generalized anxiety. It was sharp and specific, focused entirely on one particular wall in my room, The wall that, as it happened, backed directly onto a storage space the landlord had access to from the other side. I did not know why that particular wall filled me with such specific horror, only that every time I sat with my back to it, or lay in bed close enough to touch it, my skin would crawl and my stomach would twist into a tight, nauseated knot, as though some part of me understood a danger that the rest of me could not consciously explain. My room happened to be the larger of the two bedrooms in that basement apartment, while my roommate's room was barely bigger than a closet, cramped and awkward in a way that made it difficult for her to even fit a full dresser inside comfortably. Given how badly I was struggling with the fear centered around my own room, and given how much smaller and more uncomfortable her space already was, she eventually made the decision to move her mattress into my room so the two of us could share the larger space together. I do not think either of us framed it explicitly at the time as being about the wall specifically. We told ourselves it just made more practical sense, that it would be nice to have company, that her room really was too small to be worth the trouble. But looking back now, I think some deep unspoken part of both of us understood exactly why we needed to be in the same room together at night, even if neither of us said it directly out loud. Sharing the room with my roommate helped in some ways, mostly because I no longer had to lie there alone in the dark, listening to every small sound the apartment made, wondering whether each creak or shift was simply the building settling or something else entirely. But even with her there, even with the comfort of another person's steady breathing a few feet away, I still could not shake the feeling that grew stronger every day. The sense that whatever was on the other side of that wall knew exactly where I slept and was simply waiting for the right moment. I never told her the full extent of it, not at first, not wanting to sound as unstable as I feared I might if I tried to put it into words. It is one thing to say you feel uneasy in a new apartment. It is another thing entirely to admit that you lie awake most nights, genuinely convinced that someone or something is going to break through the wall beside your bed and kill you. A fear so specific and so persistent that it started to feel less like ordinary anxiety and more like some kind of warning I did not yet know how to interpret. Around this same time, I started to notice something happening whenever I took our dog out into the backyard at night for her last bathroom break before bed. The house had an upper floor above the basement unit we rented, and every single time I stepped outside into that yard after dark, I would get the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that someone up on that top floor was standing at a window, watching me. It was not just a passing paranoid thought that I could shake off and dismiss. It was a heavy, persistent sensation, the kind of feeling you get when you know, without needing visual confirmation, that eyes are fixed directly on you from somewhere close by. I would glance up at the dark windows above and see nothing. No silhouette, no movement, no light, and yet the feeling of being watched never eased even slightly. What made it far worse, what pushed it from something I might have eventually convinced myself, was simply my own nerves getting the better of me, was that my roommate started noticing the exact same thing whenever she came outside with me and the dog. Neither of us had said anything to the other about it at first, both of us privately assuming we were just being paranoid after weeks of bad sleep and general unease in that apartment. But once we finally admitted it to each other, comparing notes almost sheepishly one evening, the confirmation that we were both feeling the same specific dread from the same specific direction made the whole thing feel far less like anxiety and far more like something real. Neither of us ever managed to actually catch sight of anyone up there, no matter how quickly we sometimes turned to look. No matter how many times we tried to convince ourselves that if we just moved fast enough, we would spot a curtain falling back into place, or a shadow ducking out of view. There was simply nothing to see, only the dark glass of those upper windows staring back down at us. And yet the sensation of being watched never once let up. We even started timing our trips outside with the dog to be as brief as possible, rushing her through her business rather than letting her sniff around the way she normally liked to. Both of us eager to get back inside behind a locked door as quickly as we could manage without ever openly admitting to each other exactly why we had started doing that. Around that same period, we had a mutual guy friend, someone the two of us had met together and quickly grown close to, the kind of friend who fits so naturally into your life that within a few months it feels like he has always been there. The three of us were essentially inseparable during that stretch of time, spending most evenings together. And he ended up staying over at our apartment frequently, crashing on the couch or hanging out late into the night before eventually heading home. He never seemed to feel the same unease in that apartment that my roommate and I did, or if he did, he never mentioned it. And in some strange way, his easy, comfortable presence there always made the place feel just slightly less oppressive whenever he was around. The night everything finally came to a head, the three of us had been out together for most of the evening, doing nothing particularly notable, just spending time the way we always did. Eventually, our friend decided to head home for the night, said his goodbyes, and left my roommate and me alone back at the apartment. The two of us stayed up talking for a few more hours after that, the conversation drifting the way it does late at night between close friends, until we noticed the time creeping toward 3 in the morning and realized, with mild irritation at ourselves, that we were almost certainly going to sleep straight through most of the next day if we did not get to bed soon. Before finally calling it a night, we decided to take the dog out one last time for a quick bathroom break, the same routine we had followed almost every single night since moving in. I clipped the leash onto her collar before heading outside, a habit I had developed specifically because our dog had a tendency to wander and get distracted if left off leash. And I did not want to be chasing her around the yard at 3 in the morning when all I wanted was to get her back inside and finally go to sleep myself. My roommate came out with me, the two of us standing near the door while the dog sniffed around the yard doing her business, both of us tired and eager to get this last small task finished so we could finally climb into bed. Neither of us said much, both running on the particular quiet exhaustion that settles in during the very early hours of the morning, the kind that makes even simple tasks feel slower and heavier than they should. The yard was quiet, too, unusually so, without even the distant hum of traffic that normally drifted over from the nearby streets at that hour. And looking back now, I sometimes wonder if that unnatural stillness should have been warning enough on its own, though at the time neither of us thought anything of it beyond simple relief that the night was almost over. It was standing there by that door, waiting on the dog, keeping half an eye on her while she wandered a few feet away, sniffing at the grass, that I first saw them. Shadows, tall and vaguely human-shaped, moving steadily toward my roommate and me across the dark yard. I do not know how else to describe what I saw, except to say that they were unmistakably shaped like people, walking figures cut out of darkness itself, approaching us with a slow, deliberate pace that made every instinct in my body scream that something was deeply wrong. I do not know exactly what came over me in that moment, whether it was pure animal fear or some flash of instinct faster than conscious thought, but before I had even fully processed what I was looking at, I heard myself screaming at the top of my lungs for my roommate to get inside the house. She looked at me like I had completely lost my mind, confused and startled by the sudden panic in my voice. But something in my tone must have convinced her this was not the moment to ask questions, because within seconds, the two of us and the dog were scrambling through the door together, moving faster than I think either of us had ever moved in our lives. We made it down the small flight of stairs leading into the basement apartment itself. Both of us breathing hard, hearts hammering, and it was right there at the bottom of those stairs that we both saw them. Eyes, red eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, peering directly into the small, cheap windows set low along that basement wall, the exact kind of windows every basement apartment has, positioned right around ground level outside. I do not have a rational explanation for what those eyes belong to. I only know that both my roommate and I saw them at the exact same moment, both of us frozen for a fraction of a second, in pure, horrified disbelief, before the screaming started in earnest. I screamed until my throat hurt, calling out desperately for our friend who had left just a few hours earlier, as if shouting his name into an empty apartment could somehow summon him back to us. It made no logical sense in the moment. He was already gone, already miles away, already presumably fast asleep in his own bed, and yet some part of me needed to call for him anyway, needed to reach for the one person who might be able to make sense of what was happening, or simply make us feel less impossibly alone in that basement. And then, almost as if some strange thread connected us across the distance, my roommate's phone rang. It was him. He would tell us later that he could not explain exactly why, that he had simply been lying in bed, unable to shake an overwhelming feeling that he needed to check on us immediately. A feeling strong enough that he acted on it, without fully understanding why himself. We did not waste any time asking too many questions in that moment. We told him what had happened, our voices shaking, and asked him to come back over as soon as he possibly could. He was there within what felt like no time at all. From that night forward, he stayed with us almost every single night for the following 2 weeks, sleeping over on our couch, unwilling to leave the two of us alone in that apartment after everything that had happened. Neither my roommate nor I ever again felt entirely safe being alone in that basement after that particular night, not for one single moment. And having him there, even just asleep in the next room, made an enormous difference in how we were able to function through those final couple of weeks before we finally found a way out. We started leaving lights on throughout the apartment overnight, something we had never bothered with before, and none of us ever went out into that backyard again after dark, not even for the dog, who had to make do with quick trips out the front instead, always with at least 2 of us standing together by the door the entire time. In the days immediately following that night, the 3 of us tried to piece together some kind of rational explanation for what had happened, the way people always do when confronted with something they cannot easily accept. We wondered if the shadows might have been nothing more than a trick of streetlight filtering through the trees, or if the red eyes could somehow have belonged to a raccoon or a stray cat catching the light at an unusual angle. We wanted very badly to believe one of these explanations, to be able to laugh the whole thing off eventually as an overblown case of nerves brought on by exhaustion and an admittedly creepy old house. But no explanation we came up with ever quite fit what we had actually experienced. Raccoons do not walk upright in tall, distinctly human-shaped silhouettes. Streetlight does not explain why both of us, independently and simultaneously, felt the exact same specific dread pointed at the exact same wall for weeks before that night ever happened. Every rational explanation we tried on eventually fell apart under the weight of everything else that had already been building for weeks before that final incident, and eventually we simply stopped trying to explain it away at all, because doing so felt like it was only going to make actually living there afterward that much harder to manage. We ended up moving out of that apartment as quickly as we possibly could, breaking the lease early despite the financial hit it cost us, both of us willing to eat that loss rather than spend one more month in that house than we absolutely had to. To this day, neither my roommate nor I have ever been able to shake the feeling that the landlord, or whoever else was living up on that top floor above us, had something directly to do with everything we experienced down there. We never had any solid proof of it, nothing we could have taken to anyone or used to explain what had actually happened in any way that would sound remotely credible to someone who had not lived through it themselves. All we had was the accumulated weight of everything that occurred during those few short weeks, the nightmares, the specific dread centered on that one shared wall, the certainty of being watched from above every single time we stepped into that yard after dark, and finally those shadow figures and those glowing red eyes on the one night neither of us will ever fully forget. My roommate and I have talked about that night many times over the years since, usually late at night ourselves, usually after a few drinks have loosened us up enough to bring it back up, without either of us feeling quite as foolish discussing it as we might in the daylight. Every single time we go over it, our memories of the core details line up perfectly. The shadows moving toward us across the yard, the desperate scramble into the house, those small basement windows and the red eyes staring back at us from the other side of the glass. Neither of us has ever once wavered on those central facts, even as the years have passed, and even as both of us have grown into adults far less inclined than we once were to entertain anything that sounds remotely supernatural. If it really had been nothing more than nerves and exhaustion, I think one of us would have eventually talked the other out of it by now, would have gently suggested that maybe we were remembering things a little more dramatically than they actually happened. That has never occurred. If anything, comparing our memories against each other over the years has only reinforced how consistent and how real the entire experience felt to both of us independently. Our friend, the one who called that night out of nowhere and came rushing over without ever fully being able to explain why, still brings it up himself sometimes too. Still shakes his head slightly whenever the subject comes up, telling us he has never in his life felt an urge as strong or as inexplicable as the one that got him out of bed and back into his car that particular night. He has told us more than once that he can still picture exactly how dark and quiet the street was on his drive back over, how empty the sidewalks were, and how the entire time he kept telling himself he was probably overreacting to nothing, right up until he pulled up outside and heard the two of us still screaming from somewhere inside. None of us have ever managed to find a satisfying explanation for any of it. Not the nightmares. Not the specific dread centered on that shared wall, not the feeling of being watched from above, and certainly not those shadows and those glowing red eyes on the final night before we finally decided we had seen enough. I know exactly how this sounds. I know that laid out plainly like this, it reads like the kind of story easy to dismiss, easy to explain away as the overactive imaginations of two exhausted 20-year-olds living in an admittedly creepy old basement apartment, primed by stress and bad sleep to see danger where there was none. Believe whatever you want to believe about it. I have stopped trying to convince people who were not there, because I understand there is no way to fully capture, in words alone, exactly how it felt to see those shapes moving toward us in the dark, or to look down at those small basement windows and find ourselves staring back at eyes that glowed faintly red in a way no ordinary eyes ever should. All I know for certain is that it happened, that my roommate saw exactly what I saw at exactly the same moment, and that 8 years later, I still get a cold, prickling feeling along the back of my neck every single time the streetcar happens to pass by that particular house on its route through downtown, my eyes drifting toward those same small basement windows without my even meaning them to, half expecting, even now, to see something looking back. When my twin brother and I were still kids, summer vacation meant one thing above everything else, sleeping in as late as our bodies would allow, staying up far too late the night before playing games or watching television long past when we should have gone to bed, and then drifting into that lazy, unstructured rhythm that only exists during those few precious months when there is no school, schedule dictating your life. Our house back then was an older, two-story place at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the kind of house that made small, settling sounds throughout the night that we had long since learned to tune out. Creaks in the floorboards and soft groans in the walls that never meant anything more than an old structure adjusting to the changing temperature outside. It was during one of those long, formless summer nights that something happened in our house that neither of us has ever been able to fully explain. Something that still occasionally surfaces in our conversations even now, decades later, always accompanied by the same uneasy silence that follows whenever we try to talk about it in any real detail. Our father had gone out that evening. Nothing unusual about that in itself, since he often ran errands or met up with friends in the evenings during the summer when the heat of the day had finally broken and the air outside felt more bearable. Our mother had already gone up to bed a little earlier than usual that night, tired from a long day, leaving my brother and me downstairs on our own the way she often did once we were old enough to be trusted for an hour or two without direct supervision. We had the television on low, half watching some late-night rerun neither of us particularly cared about, mostly just enjoying the lazy, unstructured freedom of being awake this late with nowhere we needed to be in the morning. What made that particular night different from the dozens of similar evenings that came before it was that our father never actually made it back home, at least not in the way we expected. He had a very specific way of knocking on our front door whenever he forgot his keys, a distinct rhythm he always used. 3 short knocks followed by a slightly longer pause, and then 2 more. A pattern so familiar to my brother and me that we could have picked it out instantly from any other knock in the world. It was practically a kind of code between our family, something so specific and so consistent that neither of us ever had to think twice about it whenever we heard it. The moment either of us caught that particular rhythm against the front door, we knew immediately, without any doubt at all, that it was our dad standing outside waiting to be let in. We had heard that same knock hundreds of times over the years, and it had never once, not a single time before that night, been anything other than exactly what it sounded like. That night, sometime around 11 o'clock, long after our mother had already gone to bed and left the two of us alone downstairs watching television in the dim glow of the living room, we heard that exact knock. 3 short raps, a pause, then 2 more. The pattern so precise and so familiar that neither of us hesitated for even a second. We jumped up from the couch immediately, practically racing each other to the front door, already talking to each other about how Dad had probably forgotten his keys again, the way he sometimes did, laughing a little at the predictability of it as we hurried down the front hallway, our socked feet sliding slightly on the wood floor in our haste to reach the door before the other one could claim the small victory of getting there first. Even in our rush, some small habit of caution kicked in, the kind of thing you are taught to do as a kid even when you are fairly certain who is on the other side of the door. Before opening it, we called out, asking who was knocking, expecting to hear our father's familiar voice answer back immediately, maybe with some tired joke about forgetting his keys again or teasing us for taking too long to answer. Instead, there was nothing, no response at all, just silence on the other side of that door, a silence that felt oddly heavy given how certain we had both been only seconds earlier that we knew exactly who was standing there. My brother and I looked at each other, both of us a little confused, but not yet particularly worried, and after a moment we simply shrugged it off, telling each other that we had probably just imagined the sound. Or that maybe Dad had already given up waiting and gone around to try a different door. Or that we had simply misheard something entirely unrelated to a knock at all. Summer nights carry all kinds of odd sounds, we told ourselves. Insects and settling houses and distant traffic, and it was easy enough in that moment to convince ourselves that our ears had simply played a small trick on us. We even debated briefly whether to just open the door anyway, reasoning that if it really was Dad playing some kind of joke, he would eventually get tired of standing out there in the dark waiting for a reaction that was not coming. We had barely turned back around to head toward the living room when we heard it again. The exact same knock. 3 short raps, that same distinct pause, then 2 more, played out against the front door with the same precise rhythm as before. Impossible to mistake for anything else. This time there was no room left for shrugging it off as imagination. Not when we had both heard it identically, twice in a row, within the space of only a minute or 2. We turned back toward the door again, and once more called out, asking who was there, our voices a little less steady than before. A small thread of uncertainty creeping into what had started as simple curiosity. And once again, there was no answer. Nothing but silence pressing back against us from the other side of that door, a silence that somehow felt different this time, heavier, more deliberate, as though whatever was standing out there was choosing not to answer rather than simply being unable to. I remember pressing my ear closer to the door for a brief moment, straining to catch any hint of movement or breathing on the other side, and hearing absolutely nothing at all, not even the ordinary sounds of someone shifting their weight while they waited. That was the point where the two of us started to feel genuinely uneasy rather than merely puzzled. We were still young enough and stubborn enough to try to explain the whole thing away as some kind of joke our father was playing on us, the sort of thing he occasionally did when he was in a particularly playful mood, knocking and staying quiet just to make us wonder, before eventually bursting out laughing at our confused expressions once we finally opened the door. Clinging to that explanation, or at least trying to, we decided the safest thing to do was head upstairs, putting some distance between ourselves and the front door while we waited to see what would happen next, half expecting to hear our father's laughter break the silence and reveal the whole thing as nothing more than an elaborate joke at our expense. Looking back now, I am not entirely sure why heading upstairs felt safer than simply staying near the door, except that some instinct in both of us, young as we were, seemed to understand that putting a floor between ourselves and whatever was outside felt better than standing directly in front of it, waiting to see what happened next. We had barely made it partway up the stairs when we heard something else entirely, a sound that neither of us has ever been able to describe with total confidence, though we have both tried many times over the years whenever the memory comes up. It sounded exactly like a doorknob turning, followed immediately by the unmistakable creak and swing of a door opening, the specific sound our bedroom door always made whenever it moved on its slightly stiff old hinges. The problem, the detail that turned our uneasy curiosity into outright fear in an instant, was that our bedroom door was closed. We both knew it was closed. We had closed it ourselves earlier that evening before coming downstairs to watch television, the way we always did. And there was no reason at all for it to suddenly be opening on its own from somewhere upstairs, while the two of us stood frozen together on the staircase, listening to a sound that should not have been possible, given exactly where we were and exactly what we already knew to be true about the state of that door. Being twins, my brother and I had always shared a kind of shorthand between us that other siblings sometimes envied, an ability to communicate entire thoughts with nothing more than a glance, a quality that made the fear in that moment feel somehow more intense than it might have for two children who were not so closely bonded. I did not need him to say anything out loud for me to know exactly what he was thinking, and he did not need me to explain what I had just heard for him to understand it just as clearly as I did. Whatever confidence we had managed to hold on to up to that point evaporated completely the instant that door sound reached us from somewhere upstairs, replaced by a shared, wordless certainty that something in our house that night was very wrong. Neither of us said anything to each other in that moment. We did not need to. I remember catching my brother's eye and seeing my own fear mirrored back at me exactly. The same wide, uncertain look that comes when a child's mind is trying desperately to find some rational explanation and coming up completely empty. Without any real discussion between us, we both turned at almost the exact same instant and ran, taking the remaining stairs two at a time, our bare feet slapping hard against the wood, driven by an instinct that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with pure animal fear. It was as we were running that we heard the footsteps behind us, heavy ones, distinctly heavier and more forceful than either of our own light. Quick steps, thudding against the stairs with a rhythm that made it unmistakably clear that something else was climbing those same stairs right along with us, moving fast, closing the distance behind us with every second that passed. We did not dare look back, both of us too terrified to slow down even for the fraction of a second it would have taken to glance over our shoulders and confirm what we were hearing. When we finally did risk a glance back, once we reached the top landing, there was nothing there. No one behind us at all, despite the fact that we could both still hear, or at least believed we could still hear. Those same heavy footsteps somewhere close behind, as though whatever was chasing us existed just slightly outside whatever range our eyes were capable of registering in that frantic, adrenaline-soaked moment. That brief, useless glance back cost us precious seconds, and the moment we turned forward again, the footsteps seemed even closer than before, as though our hesitation had somehow allowed whatever was behind us to gain ground. We sprinted the rest of the way down the hallway toward our shared bedroom, reaching the door together, both of us grabbing for it at the same time, desperate to get inside and slam it shut behind us, needing that thin barrier of wood between ourselves and whatever was following so close behind. The hallway had never felt so long before, every familiar picture frame and doorway along the walls blurring past us in the dim light as we ran. Our own ragged breathing loud in our ears, drowning out almost everything except the pounding of those heavier footsteps somewhere behind us, and the frantic thudding of our own hearts. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run faster, to not let whatever was behind us close that remaining gap, and I remember distinctly the strange, useless thought crossing my mind even in the middle of that terror, wondering how something could sound so heavy and so close without ever once appearing when either of us dared to glance back. We threw our combined weight against the door to force it closed as quickly as possible, and instead of the door simply swinging shut the way it should have, we felt and heard a heavy, solid thud. The unmistakable impact of hitting something, some kind of resistance meeting the door from the other side, exactly where a person's body would have been standing had someone actually been running up, right behind us. The door itself flew back open slightly from the force of that impact, bouncing away from the frame the way it would if it had genuinely collided with something solid and substantial, rather than simply swinging freely through empty air the way it should have if nothing at all had actually been there. That thud, more than the knocking, more than the footsteps, more than the sound of our own bedroom door somehow opening on its own from downstairs, was the single moment that broke whatever remaining composure either of us had managed to hold on to up to that point. We did not try to close the door again after that. We did not stop to look behind us or investigate what exactly we had felt collide with it. We simply dove together onto the nearest bed, pulling the blankets up over our heads the way children do when some deep instinctive part of the brain believes that fabric alone can somehow stop the impossible from reaching you. And we started screaming, both of us, at the top of our lungs. Our voices tangled together in pure, unfiltered terror, calling out for our parents with everything we had left in us. It did not take long before we heard our mother's footsteps rushing down the hallway toward our room, followed almost immediately by our father's heavier ones right behind her. The door, the same door that only moments earlier had flown back from what felt like a direct collision with something solid, swung open easily under our mother's hand, revealing nothing more dramatic than the two of them standing there in the doorway, both looking understandably alarmed at the sound of their two children screaming bloody murder in the middle of the night. Our mother crossed the room quickly and pulled back the blankets we had buried ourselves under, her face shifting from concern to visible confusion as she took in the two of us, tangled together, both crying too hard to form a coherent sentence, our small chests still heaving from the run up the stairs, our hands still gripping fistfuls of the blanket as though letting go of it might somehow let whatever we had been running from back in. It took several long minutes before either my brother or I could manage to explain, through tears and half-formed sentences tumbling over each other, everything that had just happened. The knocking, the silence when we called out, the sound of our door opening downstairs when we knew for certain it had been closed, the footsteps chasing us up the stairs, and finally that heavy, undeniable thud against our bedroom door. Our father checked the hallway and the stairs while we spoke, flipping on every light switch he passed, and came back a few minutes later reporting that he had not found anything unusual. No open windows, no sign that anyone had broken in anywhere in the house. Nothing at all out of place, though he admitted, almost as an afterthought, that the air near the top of the stairs had felt strangely cold to him, colder than the rest of the house, though he brushed it off at the time as nothing more than a draft from an old window somewhere nearby. Our parents listened to the whole disjointed account patiently, exchanging a look between themselves that, looking back now, as an adult, I recognize as the particular kind of look parents share when they do not want to alarm their children further, but are genuinely troubled by what they are hearing. Our mother assured us gently that it had probably all been our imaginations running away with us, the kind of thing that happens easily to two overtired kids up far too late during summer vacation, minds primed for fear after a long day and an even longer evening of television. It was a comforting explanation. And in that moment, wrapped safely between both of our parents, exhausted and thoroughly spent from all the screaming and running, we were more than willing to accept it. At least enough to finally let ourselves calm down and eventually drift off to sleep with the lights left on and our bedroom door propped wide open for the rest of that night. It was only the next morning, once the fear of the previous night had faded into the safer, more manageable territory of daylight memory, that the explanation our mother had offered the night before completely fell apart. Our father, still slightly bleary-eyed over his morning coffee, mentioned in passing that he had never actually left the house at all that entire night, that he had been upstairs the whole time working quietly in a back room, focused enough on what he was doing that he had not even realized how late it had gotten until he finally came out to check on everyone and found the house eerily quiet, every light left burning, and our bedroom door standing wide open. He had assumed, when he first noticed the lights, that we had simply forgotten to turn them off before bed, another ordinary bit of childhood carelessness, and had thought nothing more of it until our mother filled him in the next morning on everything that had actually happened during the night. My brother and I sat there at the breakfast table, listening to this, And I remember the exact feeling that settled over both of us at the exact same moment. A cold, sinking recognition that whatever explanation we had comforted ourselves with the night before no longer made any sense at all. If our father had never left the house, if he had been upstairs the entire time working quietly in that back room, then the knock we had heard. That same distinct 3 and 2 rhythm we had both recognized instantly, and without a shred of doubt, had not belonged to him. Someone or something had knocked on our front door using our father's exact specific pattern. A pattern that, as far as either of us knew, only our own family had ever used or would have any reason to know. Our mother, sitting across the table, went noticeably quiet at that point, no longer offering the same reassuring explanations she had given the night before, and I remember thinking, even at that young age, that her silence somehow felt more unsettling than anything she could have actually said out loud. We have talked about that night many times over the years since, my brother and I. Usually not by choice, so much as the memory simply resurfacing on its own during some quiet conversation, the way certain memories do no matter how much time has passed. We have never managed to come up with any explanation that actually accounts for everything we both experienced that night. It was not simply one strange sound that could be dismissed as an overactive imagination or a trick of an old house settling. It was an entire sequence of events, each one building on the last, each one confirmed independently by both of us at the exact same moment, culminating in a physical impact against our bedroom door solid enough to send it flying back on its hinges. An impact that neither of us has ever been able to attribute to anything we can name. Over the years, we have compared notes on that night more times than I can count, usually late at night ourselves, usually when the conversation has already wandered somewhere quiet and reflective, and one of us brings it up almost without meaning to. Every single time, our memories line up in exactly the same order, the same details, the same specific rhythm of the knock, the same silence when we called out, the same sound of a door opening that should have been closed, the same heavy footsteps behind us on the stairs, and that same final thud against our bedroom door. Neither of us has ever once remembered it differently from the other. Never once softened a detail or added something new that the other did not already recall independently. And for two people recounting a single frightening night from early childhood, that kind of consistency across so many years has always struck both of us as significant in its own quiet way. Twins are sometimes accused of finishing each other's sentences or reinforcing each other's memories simply out of closeness. But this was never that. This was two separate accounts, given independently on more than one occasion over the years, that simply happened to match perfectly every single time. We have also, more than once, tried to ask our father directly whether he remembered anything unusual about that particular summer, whether there had been any strange visitors to the neighborhood around that time, any odd occurrences he might have chosen not to mention to two frightened children the next morning. He has always maintained that he genuinely has no memory of anything out of the ordinary beyond what he already told us, that he was simply upstairs working, oblivious to everything happening 2 floors below him until he finally came out and found the house unnervingly quiet. Whether that quiet had settled in only after whatever chased us up those stairs had already given up and gone wherever it came from, none of us has ever been able to say for certain. Our mother, for her part, has always been more reluctant to discuss it at all, usually finding some reason to change the subject whenever it comes up, though on the rare occasions she has engaged with it directly, she has admitted that something about the whole account never sat right with her either, even all these years later. To this day, whenever my brother and I happen to be back at our childhood home together, visiting our parents during the holidays or some other occasion, Neither of us ever fully relaxes once evening starts to fall. We joke about it sometimes, the way adults joke about the things that frightened them as children, trying to keep the memory light and manageable rather than let it sit too heavily in the room. But underneath the joking, I know my brother feels exactly what I still feel every single time. A small, persistent wariness whenever a knock comes at that particular front door late in the evening. A brief flicker of hesitation before either of us moves to answer it, some old instinctive part of both of us still half expecting, even now, to call out asking who is there, and to be met, once again, with nothing but silence on the other side. During my junior year of college, I moved into a large old house along with a number of other students, the kind of sprawling, subdivided rental property that colleges near campus always seem to have plenty of, packed full with more tenants than any reasonable person would probably guess just by looking at it from the street. There were 4 of us sharing the first floor, 5 more up on the second floor, and then 2 additional people living up in some kind of small converted space above that. People we barely interacted with at all during the entire time I lived there, more like distant neighbors than actual housemates, despite technically sharing the same address. Rent was cheap for the location, close enough to campus that most of us could walk to class within 10 minutes. And that convenience alone was enough to make all 9 or 10 of us willing to overlook how strange the arrangement was, how little we actually knew about the people living just 1 floor away, and how old and worn the house itself already felt the very first time any of us walked through the front door. The house itself was very old, the kind of place with creaking floorboards and slightly uneven walls that told you it had been standing for a very long time before any of us ever moved in, but nothing about it struck me as particularly unusual at first. Just an old house doing what old houses do, settling and creaking the way they always have. That impression of ordinary, harmless age lasted right up until the first time I actually went down into the basement. The basement itself served almost no practical purpose for any of us living there. There was an old washing machine and dryer down there, both of them long since broken and completely non-functional, leaving us to rely on a laundromat a few blocks away for anything involving actual clean clothes. Because of this, none of us had any real regular reason to go down into that basement at all, except on the occasional night when we hosted some kind of gathering or party and needed the extra space, since it was really only used as an overflow area for those kinds of larger social occasions rather than for anything practical or day-to-day. What always struck me as strange about that basement, from essentially the very first time I ever set foot down there, was one particular room toward the back. A room that was always kept locked, no exceptions, every single time I happened to be down there, for whatever reason. I could not have told you, in any concrete sensory terms, exactly what it was about that locked door that bothered me so much, but every single time I found myself anywhere near it, I felt this overwhelming, unmistakable sense of fear settle over me, a heavy dread that made me want to be anywhere else in the house, except standing in that basement, anywhere close to that particular door. It was not the kind of vague unease you sometimes feel in an old, dimly lit basement generally. It was specific, focused entirely on that one locked room, distinct enough that I found myself instinctively avoiding that entire corner of the basement whenever I could, even during parties, even when everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable being down there. I remember more than once catching myself holding my breath slightly whenever I had to walk past that particular corner, an instinct I never consciously decided on, my body simply reacting on its own the moment that door came into view, as though some deeper part of me understood something my conscious mind had no way of actually knowing. I eventually learned the story behind that locked room from one of my roommates, who had been living in the house slightly longer than I had, and had actually been present during the earliest days after everyone first moved in that year, back before the door had ever been locked at all. We were sitting around one evening early in the semester, the way new roommates often do while still getting to know each other, swapping small stories about our lives and our new living situation, and it was during that fairly casual conversation that the subject of the basement first came up, almost in passing, before quickly becoming considerably more serious than either of us had expected. According to her, when the group first moved into the house at the very beginning of that school year, that particular room in the basement had not yet been secured, and out of simple curiosity, one of the other girls living in the house had gone in to take a look around, the way you naturally would with any unfamiliar space in a new home you were still getting to know. What she found in there, according to what my roommate told me, was deeply disturbing. Several human teeth scattered somewhere within the room, along with a collection of items she described only as strange tools. Unable or unwilling to elaborate much further on exactly what those tools looked like, or what they might have been used for. My roommate admitted that she herself had never actually seen the room or its contents directly, relying entirely on second-hand descriptions from the girl who had originally gone in, and that by the time she heard about it, the door had already been locked, leaving her with nothing but a second-hand account and her own imagination to fill in whatever details had never been fully explained. Not long after that discovery was reported, the landlord, someone who had apparently only recently purchased the property himself, not long before renting it out to our group, came by and locked that door personally. And as far as I know, it was never opened again by anyone for the remainder of the time any of us lived in that house. Nobody in the house ever got a clear explanation from the landlord about what exactly had been found down there, why it had been left in that condition, or what precisely he intended to do about it going forward. He simply locked the door, offered no further comment on the matter beyond some vague reassurance that it would be dealt with. And the whole incident slowly faded into the background of everyday house life. The kind of unsettling story that gets repeated occasionally among roommates, but that nobody actively investigates further. Especially not a group of college students with rent to pay and classes to attend, more inclined to simply avoid an unpleasant topic than dig deeper into it. My roommate told me that a couple of people had briefly considered contacting the police about it at the time, but that nothing ever came of those conversations. Partly out of uncertainty over whether it was even worth the hassle, and partly, she admitted, out of a kind of collective unspoken agreement that the whole thing was easier to simply not think about too carefully. Fast forward a few months into that same school year to an afternoon that started out completely unremarkable in every way. I had just woken up from an afternoon nap and made my way into the kitchen to cook myself something to eat, and as it happened, I was the only person on our entire floor at that particular moment. Everyone else out at class, or otherwise occupied elsewhere. I remember standing at the stove, food cooking in a pan in front of me. My mind mostly occupied with ordinary, mundane thoughts. Nothing at all out of the ordinary about the moment until the hallway light to my left suddenly turned off on its own. My first reaction was simple and unremarkable, the kind of instant, low-level assumption anyone would make in that situation. I figured the bulb had probably just burnt out, an entirely ordinary occurrence in an old house full of aging fixtures and inconsistent wiring, and I did not think much more of it beyond that initial assumption. Then, only moments later, the light turned back on by itself. This immediately struck me as considerably stranger than a simple burnt-out bulb, since a burnt-out bulb does not typically turn itself back on again after going dark. What made the whole thing even more unsettling was a detail about the layout of our floor that I happened to know well from months of living there. The actual light switch controlling that particular hallway light was located in the stairwell. on the other side of a closed door separating that stairwell from the rest of our living space. For that light to turn off and then back on, someone would have needed to physically walk into that stairwell, flip the switch, and then presumably flip it again a few moments later, and I was, as far as I knew with total certainty, completely alone on that entire floor at the time. I waited there for a minute, watching that light, my food still cooking on the stove behind me, and sure enough, after that short pause, the light turned off again. Something in me shifted at that point from simple confusion into a more active kind of alarm, and I quickly walked over to the door separating our space from the stairwell, fully convinced in that moment that someone had to be messing with me, somehow. Some elaborate prank being pulled by a roommate hiding just out of sight, and I threw the door open expecting to catch them in the act. My heart was already beating faster than usual as I did this, some part of me half expecting to find someone standing right there on the other side, grinning, ready to admit they had been messing with the switch the entire time. An outcome that, looking back now, I would have welcomed far more than what actually happened next. There was no one there. I walked down the stairwell myself at that point, checking the floor below just to be absolutely certain, and found nobody down there either. The entire lower level of the house appearing just as empty and undisturbed as my own floor. I stood there for a moment at the bottom of those stairs, feeling a small flicker of genuine unease creeping in now, but I quickly pushed it back down, telling myself firmly that it had to be some kind of electrical problem, an explanation that felt considerably more comfortable to accept than any of the alternatives quietly forming at the edges of my mind. I even walked over and briefly inspected the light switch itself while I was down there, half looking for some visible sign of a wiring fault, a loose connection, anything at all that might offer a concrete, mundane explanation, but the switch looked entirely ordinary, no different from every other light switch in that house I had flipped 1,000 times before without incident. Nothing about it looked tampered with or unusual in any way. No scorch marks, no exposed wiring, nothing that would have given even the most cautious inspector a reason for concern. I went back upstairs and returned to my food, trying to settle back into the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon I had been having only minutes earlier, though I noticed my hands were not quite as steady as they had been when I first started cooking. Almost immediately after I resumed cooking, that same light flicked off and back on again, quick and sudden, exactly the way it had before. I remember just standing there for a few seconds afterward, completely still, staring at that light. My mind working hard to process what was happening, while some deeper, more primal part of me had already begun quietly sounding the alarm, warning me that something about this situation was not, in fact, a simple electrical malfunction, no matter how badly I wanted that explanation to be the correct one. It was in the middle of that frozen moment that music started playing, coming clearly from the living room, which sat directly adjacent to the kitchen I was standing in. For one brief, genuinely relieved instant, I actually felt my whole body relax slightly, assuming this meant someone else had come home after all, that I was not actually alone in the house the way I had believed, and that whatever explanation existed for the light would probably turn out to be something perfectly ordinary once I found whoever was responsible for the music now filling the living room. I walked into the living room expecting to find a roommate there, and instead found the room completely empty. Sitting on a small ledge near the window was a laptop, closed, connected by a cable to a set of external speakers that were unmistakably the source of the music currently playing throughout the room. Across from that, the television was on, tuned to nothing but static. That familiar, unsettling gray and white noise you see so often in horror movies, playing out in front of me in what felt, in that moment, like an almost surreal, deliberately staged tableau, rather than anything that could have happened by simple accident. I remember standing frozen, just inside the doorway for a moment, taking in the whole scene. The music, the static-filled screen casting its flickering gray light across the otherwise empty room, and feeling a growing certainty that I had somehow stepped into something that was not meant for me to see. Something arranged with an eerie, deliberate precision that no accidental malfunction could have produced. I approached the speakers slowly, my heart already pounding hard in my chest. And it was as I got closer that I realized, with a fresh jolt of dread, that the laptop connected to those speakers was completely closed, the screen shut, no visible light or indication anywhere that it was even powered on at all. There was no reasonable way for that laptop, sitting there closed and apparently inactive, to be the actual source of music playing clearly and audibly through speakers connected directly to it. I reached down and unplugged the speakers myself, and the music stopped instantly the moment I did. I genuinely wish, even now, that I could remember exactly what song had been playing, some detail that might help make sense of any of this later. But I had considerably more pressing things occupying my mind in that particular moment than trying to memorize a melody. That was the point where the real chill finally settled fully into my chest. A cold, creeping certainty that something in that house was deeply, seriously wrong, and that I needed to get out immediately. My hands were actually shaking slightly as I turned back toward the kitchen. Some part of me still trying to process everything I had just seen and heard, while another part of me was already moving purely on instinct. I walked back into the kitchen and turned off the stove, abandoning the food I had been cooking without a second thought. Walked calmly, but quickly down the stairs, got into my car, and drove away from that house as fast as I reasonably could, not entirely sure where I was even going, only that I needed distance between myself and whatever had just happened. A few weeks passed before I finally worked up the nerve to tell my roommates the full story of what had happened that afternoon, half hoping, honestly, that one of them would simply confess to some elaborate, carefully coordinated prank, that there would turn out to be some perfectly reasonable explanation involving hidden speakers or remotely controlled lighting that a group of bored college students had rigged up as some kind of joke at my expense. Instead, when I finished telling the story, the room went quiet, an uncomfortable, heavy silence settling over everyone gathered there. And then, one by one, my roommates started admitting their own strange experiences in that house. Things none of them had previously mentioned to anyone else. Apparently, each of them privately assuming, the way I had initially assumed about my own experience, that whatever had happened to them individually must have some ordinary explanation not worth troubling everyone else with. One of the girls in the house told us that she frequently woke up in the middle of the night to noises coming specifically from inside her closet, and that on more than one occasion she had distinctly heard the sound of the hangers inside that closet, moving, shifting and knocking against each other in a way that suggested something had just brushed against or bumped into them, despite there being no one else in her room and nothing she could find afterward that would explain the movement. She told us she had started leaving her closet door slightly open at night instead of fully closed, some instinctive compromise she had settled on without ever quite being able to explain why it felt like it helped, even though logically it made no real difference to whatever was actually causing the noise. Another one of my roommates, a guy who lived on our floor, mentioned that he regularly heard footsteps coming from directly above his room, heavy and distinct enough that he assumed every single time that someone had to be walking around up there. Each time he went to check, though, walking upstairs to see who it was, he found the floor above completely empty. Nobody home at all, despite having just heard what sounded unmistakably like footsteps moving across that exact space only moments before. He said the timing of it seemed almost deliberately unpredictable, sometimes happening late at night, sometimes in the middle of the afternoon, with no consistent pattern he could ever pin down that would have let him anticipate when it might start again. Another guy in the house shared what was, by far, the most disturbing account of the evening. He told us about a night when he had woken suddenly in the middle of the night for no particular reason, only to see a dark figure standing motionless in the middle of our kitchen, positioned in such a way that it appeared to be staring directly into his room from that spot. He said he had lain there frozen, too afraid to move or make a sound, watching this figure for what felt like an unbearably long stretch of time, until it eventually turned and walked calmly toward the stairwell, disappearing from his view. And he had no idea, to this day, where it had actually gone after that, whether up, down, or simply vanishing somewhere along the way. He admitted he had never told anyone about it before that night, partly out of fear that we would think he had simply been half asleep and imagining things, and partly, he said, because some part of him had hoped that staying quiet about it might somehow keep it from happening again. Hearing all of these accounts laid out together in a single evening, each one independently confirming that we were not simply dealing with isolated coincidences or individual overactive imaginations, was genuinely one of the more unsettling experiences of my entire life, arguably even more disturbing in its own way than my own individual experience with the lights and the music had been. It meant that whatever was happening in that house was not confined to any single person's perception or any single strange afternoon. It was ongoing. It was affecting multiple people independently across different parts of the house, and it had apparently been happening for months without any of us realizing that our individual experiences were part of something larger and shared. I remember looking around the room at everyone's faces as each story was told, watching the same dawning realization pass across each of us in turn. That small, cold shift from private discomfort to shared, confirmed dread, and feeling, oddly, both more frightened and slightly less alone in that fear than I had been carrying it by myself for those past few weeks. Nobody laughed that night. Nobody tried to lighten the mood with a joke the way college students so often do, even in uncomfortable situations, and by the time the last story had been told, the whole house felt quieter than usual, as though even the walls themselves were listening along with the rest of us. None of us ever managed to come up with any kind of adequate explanation for any of it. Not the lights, not the music, not the footsteps, not the figure in the kitchen, and certainly not whatever had originally been found in that locked basement room before any of us moved in. We talked about it amongst ourselves fairly often after that particular evening, comparing notes, occasionally reporting new incidents to each other as they happened over the following months, but we never approached the landlord directly about any of it, uncertain what exactly we would even say, and unsure whether bringing it up would accomplish anything beyond making an already uncomfortable living situation feel even more strained. A couple of us floated the idea at various points of trying to look up the history of the house itself, searching old newspaper archives or public records for anything that might explain what had once happened there, but none of us ever actually followed through on it, whether out of simple, busy college schedules or a quieter, more instinctive reluctance to actually learn something we might not be able to unlearn afterward. I finished out that school year in that house, along with the rest of my roommates, none of us ever finding a compelling reason or an easy opportunity to break our lease early, despite everything that had happened. Breaking a lease partway through the year would have meant scrambling to find new housing on short notice, likely at a higher cost, in a college town where affordable options near campus were already scarce, and for most of us the practical difficulties of actually moving out felt At the time, somehow more daunting than simply continuing to live alongside whatever it was we had, all quietly. Agreed was sharing that house with us. We simply adjusted, the way people often do when faced with something they cannot fully explain or control. Developing small, unspoken habits, avoiding certain areas of the house after dark, never lingering too long near that basement, keeping doors closed that had no obvious reason to be closed. None of us ever went looking for further explanations, and as far as I know, that locked room in the basement remained locked for the entire remainder of the time any of us lived there. Its contents and its history never fully explained or resolved. I have not been back to that house since I moved out at the end of that school year, though I do occasionally wonder about it. Whether whoever lives there now has experienced anything similar, whether that basement room has ever been opened again, whether the dark figure my roommate described that night in the kitchen has ever appeared to anyone else since. Every so often, I will find myself searching the address online out of pure idle curiosity, half hoping to find some listing or review that mentions something unusual. Though I have never found anything of the sort, just ordinary rental listings and the occasional mundane complaint about parking or noise, nothing that would suggest to an outsider that anything about that house was ever anything other than perfectly normal. I think about that house far more often than I would like to admit, particularly on quiet evenings when the memory tends to resurface uninvited, and I have never once, in all the years since, managed to come up with any explanation that fully accounts for everything the 8 of us collectively experienced over those months, living together in a house that, as it turned out, had never really felt like it belonged entirely to us at all. This happened when I was around 7 or 8 years old, and even though it has been many years since, the memory has never once lost any of its clarity, every detail still sitting in my mind exactly as sharp and vivid as it was on the actual day it happened. I had gone over to a friend's house after school, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable weekday plan that happens constantly among kids that age. Nothing special about the arrangement itself. Just 2 friends looking to spend an afternoon together doing something more interesting than homework. My friend lived on a fairly quiet residential street, the kind of neighborhood where kids could still wander around outside without much supervision, and his house backed directly onto a large stretch of woods, thick enough and deep enough that it felt like genuine wilderness to 2 young boys, even though in reality it probably was not nearly as vast or as remote as it seemed to us at the time. I remember that particular neighborhood well, the kind of place with wide, quiet streets and mature trees lining every yard, the sort of setting where everyone seemed to know everyone else at least a little, and where kids our age still had the freedom to disappear into the woods for entire afternoons without any parent thinking twice about it. That particular afternoon, my friend and I had decided it would be a good day to finally start building the tree fort we had been talking about for weeks, the kind of ambitious backyard project that consumes the imagination of young kids everywhere, filled with grand plans that rarely match the actual modest results, but that feel enormously important and exciting in the planning stages regardless. We had spent the better part of the previous week sketching out rough plans on notebook paper during recess, arguing over how tall the walls should be and whether we needed an actual roof or just a platform. The kind of intense, earnest debate only young kids can bring to a project that adults would probably consider fairly minor in the grand scheme of things. Complete with hand-drawn diagrams, we were both convinced looked professional enough to actually guide real construction. We gathered up whatever tools and materials we thought we would need: a hammer, some nails, a handful of scrap wood pieces we had scavenged from around the yard and garage, and set off toward the woods behind his house, feeling the particular kind of confident excitement only children embarking on an unsupervised outdoor project can really feel. My friend's younger brother, who must have been 5 or 6 at the time, tagged along with us as well, eager not to be left out of whatever adventure his older brother and his friend were planning. The way younger siblings often insist on joining in, regardless of whether the older kids particularly want them there. I should mention, as a bit of important background to everything that happened afterward, that there had recently been several daytime coyote sightings reported in that general area. The kind of local news that spreads quickly among kids and parents alike in a quiet suburban neighborhood, prompting a certain heightened wariness among all of us whenever we ventured into the woods during that particular stretch of the school year. A few neighbors had reportedly spotted a coyote wandering through their yards in broad daylight on more than one occasion, and word of it had spread through the neighborhood kids the way that sort of thing always does, growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling until half the kids on the street were convinced there was some kind of dangerous wild animal lurking just beyond the tree line, ready to pounce the moment any of us wandered too far from home. I distinctly remember the three of us discussing this as we walked, half seriously and half in the exaggerated, dramatic way young kids tend to discuss potential dangers, formulating what we considered at the time to be a fairly solid defensive plan involving the hammer we had brought along for the tree fort construction. Our strategy, as I recall it, involved simply smashing any attacking coyote directly with that hammer should one happen to approach us during our building project. A plan that, looking back now as an adult, would almost certainly not have worked in any practical sense whatsoever. But that felt entirely reasonable and reassuring to the three of us at that age. Three young boys convinced of our own resourcefulness in the face of potential danger. We had even assigned roles among ourselves, deciding that I would be the one to actually wield the hammer since I was holding it at the time, while my friend would grab rocks to throw as a secondary line of defense, and his younger brother was tasked with running back to the house to get help should our combined efforts somehow fail. As we continued walking along the familiar dirt path leading out into the deeper part of the woods, the trees growing thicker and the light dimming slightly as we moved further from the open yard behind us, I remember looking down at the trail beneath my feet, watching where I stepped, while continuing to talk with my friend about our coyote defense plan and whatever other topics young kids tend to drift toward during a long walk. I was mid-conversation, my attention mostly focused on the path and on what my friend was saying, when everything around us suddenly changed in an instant. Without any warning at all, my friend's younger brother stopped completely still in his tracks, freezing in place so abruptly and so completely that it immediately registered as strange even before I had fully processed what was happening. He did not say anything. He simply stopped, his whole small body rigid, staring straight ahead into the woods in front of us. I did not immediately understand what was happening, still caught up in whatever conversation my friend and I had been having only seconds before, but within another moment or two, my friend himself also stopped abruptly, mirroring his younger brother's sudden frozen stillness. Seeing both of them stop so suddenly and so completely, I naturally stopped as well, my own body responding instinctively to the obvious alarm radiating from the two of them even before I had any idea what had caused it. There was something in the quality of their stillness that communicated danger more effectively than any words could have, a kind of tension in their small frames that immediately told me, on some level beneath conscious thought, that whatever they were looking at was not something ordinary. I lifted my eyes from the trail, following the direction both of them appeared to be staring, wanting to understand what exactly had frightened them so suddenly and so completely. What I saw in that moment has remained burned into my memory with a clarity that few other childhood experiences have ever matched, even decades later. Standing roughly 25 yards ahead of us, further down the same wooded path we had been walking along, was an elderly woman, someone I would estimate, even now, to have been somewhere in her mid to late 70s based on her general appearance. She had wavy, curly hair, a mix of gray and white, and she was dressed in a long, flowing white gown. The kind of garment that looked almost old-fashioned. Certainly not the sort of clothing you would expect to see on someone out for an ordinary walk through suburban woods on an ordinary weekday afternoon. It was not the kind of practical outdoor clothing anyone would reasonably choose for a walk through wooded terrain, no hiking boots, no jacket suited to moving through brush and uneven ground. Nothing at all that suggested she had dressed with any intention of actually being out in these particular woods that day. She was not moving at all. She stood completely motionless, her posture straight and still. And though she appeared to be facing generally in our direction, something about the way her eyes were positioned made it clear, even from that distance, that she was not actually looking directly at us. It felt instead like she was looking through us, past us, at some point far beyond where we were actually standing, an unsettling distinction that I could somehow sense clearly, even as a young child, without fully understanding why it disturbed me so deeply. I remember trying, even in that frozen moment of fear, to make sense of her expression, and finding that I could not really describe it at all. Not frightened, not angry, not particularly warm either, simply blank and distant, in a way that felt entirely disconnected from the three of us standing there watching her. Even now, all these years later, simply describing this memory out loud is enough to send a genuine chill through me, the image remaining every bit as vivid and unsettling in my mind as it was on the actual day it happened. What I am about to describe next might sound like an exaggeration, and I have always been willing to concede that it was quite possibly nothing more than my own young imagination running away with itself in a moment of genuine fear. But there did appear to be a faint, pale glow surrounding this woman, a soft aura of white light that seemed to emanate gently from around her entire figure, not bright or dramatic in any way, just a subtle, steady radiance that felt distinctly out of place against the ordinary greens and browns of the surrounding woods. I want to be honest and note that this particular detail always felt, even to me, like the part of the memory most likely to have been embellished by a frightened child's overactive imagination. However, in the years since, my friend and his brother and I have discussed this memory together on numerous occasions, comparing our individual recollections the way people often do with a shared traumatic or strange experience from childhood. And both of them have independently described that same faint white glow surrounding the woman, entirely unprompted by me, which has always struck me as significant, given how unlikely it would seem for three separate people to independently imagine the exact same specific, unusual detail if it truly had been nothing more than a trick of light or a product of individual imagination. We have never been able to explain that particular consistency away, no matter how many times we have tried, and it remains, even now, one of the strangest and most persistent aspects of the entire memory. The three of us stood there together, frozen in place, for what felt at the time like an extraordinarily long stretch of time, though realistically it was probably no more than a few seconds, perhaps 10 or 15 at most, the way time often distorts itself during moments of intense fear, stretching what would ordinarily feel brief into something that seems to last far longer than it actually does. None of us said a single word during this entire time. None of us moved. All three of us simply staring at this motionless, softly glowing woman standing there in the middle of the woods, silent and completely still, watching something that was apparently not us, despite facing generally in our direction. I remember being acutely aware, even in that frozen moment, of the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and rapid in my ears, and of how unnaturally quiet the rest of the woods had become around us. No birds calling, no wind moving through the branches overhead, nothing but that heavy, suffocating stillness pressing in from every direction, while the three of us stood there, unable to look away. Then, breaking that frozen stillness, the woman slowly raised her right arm, extending it outward and pointing, with slow, deliberate precision, back in the exact direction from which the three of us had originally come, back toward my friend's house, back toward the safety and familiarity of the yard we had left only minutes earlier. Her movement was unhurried, almost graceful, in a strange, unsettling way. Nothing at all like the quick or startled gesture you would expect from an ordinary person suddenly noticing three children nearby. The moment she completed that gesture, something shifted instantly and dramatically in all three of us simultaneously, as though her pointing had triggered some kind of immediate, involuntary response we had no ability to control or resist. Almost immediately, and like a scene from a movie, all three of us screamed at the exact same moment, dropping every single tool and piece of material we had been carrying: the hammer, the nails, the scrap wood, all of it scattering across the trail as we turned and sprinted, as fast as our young legs could possibly carry us, back in the direction the woman had just pointed, back toward my friend's house. None of us pausing, even for a fraction of a second, to look back over our shoulders at what we were leaving behind us in those woods. I do not have particularly clear memories of the actual run back through those woods, the whole experience blurring together into little more than a frantic haze of pounding footsteps, ragged breathing, and pure, unfiltered terror driving all three of us forward without a single backward glance. I remember branches whipping against my arms as we ran, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath our feet, and yet somehow none of us stumbled or fell. Some combination of pure adrenaline and desperate focus apparently carrying us through that entire stretch of woods without incident, despite how recklessly fast we were moving. What I do remember clearly is bursting out of the tree line into the familiar open space of my friend's backyard. All three of us still screaming, tears streaming down at least two of our faces, running directly toward the back door of the house and toward my friend's mother, desperate to reach the safety of an adult and to somehow explain what we had just witnessed. We told her everything, all three of us talking over each other in a frantic, disjointed rush, trying to describe the woman, the glow, the pointing gesture, the sheer overwhelming fear that had gripped all three of us simultaneously and driven us to abandon our entire tree fort project without a second thought. My friend's mother listened, the way concerned parents generally do when their children come running in, clearly frightened about something, crouching down to our level and asking gentle, careful questions, trying to piece together exactly what had scared us so badly, but ultimately, and to absolutely none of our surprise, even in that moment, she dismissed the entire account as nothing more than childhood imagination running wild, perhaps combined with the very real anxiety we had already been carrying about the recent coyote sightings in the area. She suggested, gently but firmly, that we had probably spooked ourselves, working each other up over shadows and unfamiliar shapes in the woods until our imaginations had constructed something far more dramatic and frightening than whatever had actually been there. She even offered to walk out to the woods herself to check, an offer none of the three of us had any interest in accepting, all of us shaking our heads emphatically at the mere suggestion of going anywhere near that trail again that day. At the time, exhausted and still shaking from the adrenaline of our sudden sprint back to the house, none of us had much energy left to argue the point further. And eventually the whole incident got filed away, at least outwardly, as simply another overly dramatic childhood scare, the kind of thing kids that age experience regularly and generally forget about within a few weeks, as new concerns and adventures replaced the old ones. We did not go back into those woods again that particular day. And honestly, none of us were especially eager to return to that specific trail for quite some time afterward, though eventually, as children do, we found our way back to more ordinary outdoor adventures in that same general area. Our fear gradually fading with time the way most childhood fears eventually do. The tree fort project itself never really recovered from that afternoon either. Our enthusiasm for it quietly evaporating, along with our willingness to spend much time in those particular woods, and the scattered tools and lumber we had abandoned on the trail that day were, as far as I know, simply left there, none of us ever volunteering to go back and retrieve them. What has always struck me as significant about this particular memory, the detail that has kept it feeling meaningfully different from other ordinary childhood scares I have, long since forgotten entirely, is how consistently all three of us have continued to remember it, and how remarkably little our individual accounts have ever diverged from each other over all the years since it happened. My friend, his younger brother, and I are all now well into our 20s, scattered across different cities, pursuing different careers and different lives. The way childhood friendships often eventually spread apart as people grow older, and yet whenever the three of us do manage to reconnect, whether during a holiday visit home or some other occasional gathering, that particular memory inevitably comes up eventually, usually prompted by someone bringing up childhood stories in general, and every single time, all three of us describe the exact same core details without any real variation. The woman, the white gown, the wavy gray and white hair, the faint glow surrounding her, the way she seemed to look through us rather than directly at us, and that final, deliberate gesture of her arm raising and pointing back the way we had come. The single motion that sent all three of us running before any conscious decision to run had even fully registered in our minds. I remember one particular occasion, a few years back, when the three of us happened to all be home for the holidays at the same time, sitting around my friend's parents' kitchen table late one evening. The same kitchen where all three of us had once come running in breathless and terrified all those years earlier, and somehow the conversation drifted, as it occasionally does, back toward that afternoon in the woods. His younger brother, who by that point was well into his own adult life, described the memory with the same level of vivid detail he always had, mentioning the glow around the woman before either my friend or I had said anything about it ourselves, which struck all three of us, even in that comfortable, familiar setting, as a small confirmation that none of us had simply absorbed or borrowed the detail from each other over the years through repeated retelling, our accounts remaining independently consistent in a way that continued to unsettle all three of us, just slightly, even surrounded by the warmth and familiarity of a shared holiday gathering. We sat there for a while afterward, half joking about it the way adults often do with childhood fears, but underneath the joking, there was a quieter, more genuine unease that none of us ever quite managed to shake off completely, not even after all those years of distance from the actual event itself, the conversation eventually trailing off into a thoughtful silence none of us seemed particularly eager to break. I have thought about that afternoon countless times over the years since, turning it over in my mind, searching for some rational explanation that might account for everything the three of us witnessed, and continue to remember so consistently and so vividly all these years later. I have wondered whether it might have been some elderly neighbor out for an unusual walk through the woods that day, dressed oddly for reasons that had nothing to do with anything supernatural, her white clothing simply catching the afternoon light in a way that created the illusion of a glow. Three frightened young boys already primed by coyote anxiety, misinterpreting an entirely ordinary, if unusual, encounter with an elderly stranger. It is certainly the most comfortable explanation available, and for a long time I tried to hold on to it as the most likely truth behind what we saw. I even, at one point years later, tried asking around the old neighborhood, mentioning the story casually to a couple of families who had lived there even longer than my friend's family had, hoping someone might recall an elderly woman fitting that particular description, perhaps someone with a habit of wandering those woods for her own private reasons, someone with a story or a history that might finally make sense of everything the three of us had witnessed. Nobody I spoke with ever recognized the description, and a couple of the longtime residents seemed genuinely puzzled, telling me they could not recall anyone in the area, past or present, who matched what I was describing. An elderly woman in a flowing white gown wandering alone through those particular woods, a description they agreed sounded unusual enough that they felt certain they would have remembered it themselves had they ever actually encountered her. But that explanation has never fully satisfied me, has never quite managed to account for every single detail that all three of us continue to remember so clearly and so consistently, particularly that specific, deliberate pointing gesture. The way it felt less like the confused movement of a lost or unusual stranger and more like something precise and intentional, a clear, wordless instruction directed specifically at the three of us. An elderly woman, simply out for an unusual walk, would have little reason to stand perfectly still and silent for that length of time, staring past three children rather than at them, before raising her arm in such a slow, deliberate, unmistakably purposeful gesture. Every time I try to force the memory into that more comfortable, rational shape some detail resists, refuses to fit neatly into an explanation involving nothing more than an eccentric elderly neighbor and three overly imaginative young boys, and I eventually find myself abandoning the attempt altogether, setting the memory back down exactly as it has always existed in my mind, unresolved and strange, refusing every rational frame I have ever tried to place around it. To this day, none of us has ever managed to identify who that woman might have actually been, whether she was ever seen by anyone else in the neighborhood before or after that particular afternoon, or what, if anything, she might have actually been trying to communicate to three frightened young boys standing frozen on a wooded trail. We have never gone looking for further answers, none of us particularly eager to revisit that specific stretch of woods with a deliberate intention of investigating further, content instead to simply carry the memory forward together. Three separate accounts that have somehow never once diverged from each other across all the years since. A shared, unresolved mystery from childhood that none of us has ever managed to fully explain. Perhaps that reluctance itself says something about how deeply that afternoon affected all three of us. A quiet, mutual agreement, never actually spoken aloud, that some things are better left as unanswered questions than picked apart in search of an explanation that might not even exist. Or worse, that might turn out to be something none of us are prepared to fully accept, even after all these years of carrying that memory quietly alongside each other. We simply let it remain exactly what it has always been to the three of us, a strange, vivid piece of shared childhood memory that none of us can fully account for, and that all three of us, remarkably, still remember with precisely the same unsettling clarity to this day.